Where do I start with this? Well, I guess I would have to begin by saying everyone in the family is sensitive to the paranormal side of things. Case in point, my sisters can hear things going bump in the night while my father has had some sort of guardian angel act as an early warning for when things are about to go bad. In that case, it's our old family cat. My mother never spoke about us, but her mother said she was sensitive too, in a way. As for me, well, I guess you'd say I'm a sort of an exorcist. I say sort of because the church recognizes me as the level of a deacon thanks to my time in the service, meaning I can hand out communion, but I sure can't lead a sermon. This is probably why our family members are considered so strange, at least in that way. It isn't like we don't have friends or relationships. It's just we don't perceive things the same way they do. Now, since that's out of the way, let's get into what happened. It was the middle of summer, so of course the kids were off of school, and a few of them thought it would be nice to stop by my place on their way to their vacation spot. I would go with them, but you have to be invited, of course. Then again, I'm not sure if I could just take off of work. A decent job is getting difficult to come by, and an old warhorse like me, it's getting even worse and worse. Well, I'm renting a rather large house for just one person. The rent in this area is cheap as long as you don't mind the commute. I'm an early riser anyway, so it really isn't a big deal. Regardless of that, they all arrived a bit late, which gave me enough time to have everything ready for them to come in. They had been on the road for several days at this point. It wouldn't be so bad except there's no privacy on the road. This meant that everyone was a little pent up from being stuck in a vehicle and needed some time to get a relief from the drive. With the youngest kids, this simply meant letting them run around for a few hours and, of course, letting them swim in the pool. There was only one teenager, my nephew, around 14 years old if I think so. So he swam, but I could just tell he wanted to find one of the neighborhood girls to hang out with. Too bad for him, the closest neighbor's daughter is leaving for college this fall, so a little bit out of his range. With all this moving around, it was nice to let the parents swim just for a little bit to kind of stretch their muscles and relax with a few cocktails. I even turned on the jacuzzi if they wanted. So, all in all, it was a nice afternoon for everybody. Nothing from that could have prepared us for what was going to happen, though. It must have been close to midnight when we finally got everybody to sleep. You would think after burning so much energy, the kids would have crashed out early, but nope. I give my siblings and their spouses the beds while the kids are split between the two other smaller rooms. Yes, it's a 4-bedroom. But that just meant I had to crash out on the couch, giving up all the beds to those who've been on the road. Nothing wrong with that, but it does make me sleep rather light, I guess you could say. Though it was summer, I woke up with a slight chill in the air. I shook slightly. I may have had the fans running, but it shouldn't feel that cold. I was about to go back to sleep when I saw something. In the reflection of the main window directly across from me, I could see the shadow of someone walking across the living room. The only light silhouetting it came from the kitchen stove that I had left on just in case somebody needed something from the kitchen. They wouldn't have to turn any lights on to find their way to the fridge. I also put my side of the couch in complete darkness. Even if someone looked into the reflection, they wouldn't be able to see me. As I watched for a few moments, I realized that the shadow had a clearly female form to it. But something was very, very wrong. It almost looked like its hair was extremely tall, and it was carrying a backpack? What? I thought to myself, I gained more consciousness. That doesn't make sense. No one has their hair up like that unless you just got out of the shower. But if they did, why would they put on a pack? The seconds slowly ticked by as I began to see it more clearly. It didn't walk, but instead seemed to glide across the floor as if it wasn't even stepping on it. My hardwood floors didn't squeak, however, I should feel the subtle changes of the floor with every step. But nothing. Silently, I watched as it went to the hallway where the two smaller bedrooms were. Once it was out of sight, I silently got up and followed it. I looked down the hall just in time to see the very edge of it turn into the room where some of the kids were in. Okay, what the fuck is going on? I silently said to myself as I got to the corner of the hallway. Looking around the corner, I could see that the door to the kids' room was almost completely open. The red light from the alarm clock showed enough for my eyes to see the first bed. There was my oldest niece, sound asleep, lightly snoring, as I moved slowly into the hallway. As I turned to look at the other bed, my heart skipped a beat and my blood ran cold. There was someone, or maybe I should say something, standing at the foot of my nephew's bed. It was staring at him as he silently slept. With a little bit of light, I could see a little bit more of the silhouette. The form was clearly that of an adult female, and well-developed one, but not overly so. The long hair that fell down her back flowed right down to a set of looked like wings attached to the lower back just above the pelvic bone. This was bad enough, but the stranger parts were the large horns that seemed to come halfway between her hairline and the top of her head. These horns curled back, kind of like ram horns, but didn't curl back up to her ears. I was in shock at the sight of this woman that I'd never seen. It was standing in my house and seemingly watching over my kin. After about a minute, I saw my nephew roll onto his back, and that's when something odd happened. There was a sudden smell of perfume in the air. It was very subtle at first, but soon became overwhelming. Now, something you should know about me is that I truly hate the smell of strong perfumes. In fact, too much perfume has made me leave dates early. I just can't stomach it. So the smell of this was not intoxicating as one might think, but to me, more nauseating than anything else. Once the smell permeated the room, enough that I had to hold my nose to keep from gagging, that is, she reached down and began to pull the covers off of him. Reaching down, she slowly pulled the covers down past his feet, exposing him to the night air. Then she began to move up and caress his leg as she slowly began to move up his body. That is when I saw his eyes burst open and the fear enter his blue eyes. I could see him start to struggle, but he was having trouble moving. From that point, she climbed onto the bed and began to hold him down by placing her hand on his shoulder, and while the other one pushed his hand away and down onto the bed. When she moved her leg up to straddle him, I tried to stop her. That is, I tried. My body didn't want to move. It was strange, but my muscles didn't want to respond to the commands I gave them. I was confused as I feared I wouldn't be able to stop her. By now, I had figured out what this was. Even though the logical part of my brain fought me, there was no denying the truth. What had come into my house for nefarious reasons was a succubus. Now, I'm no spring chicken, so I know a few things about the paranormal. Doesn't hurt that I dated a witch before, too. Plus, I had a few tricks up my sleeve. It must have sensed my fear because it turned and looked at me, still standing in the doorway. I looked at it right in the eyes, and I could see those green eyes, those emerald eyes, look right back at me. Those eyes were not green like you would think, but dark green like you would see almost on a tractor, or maybe in a comic. She still had her human iris, but the rest of her eye was that deep, deep green. As she looked at me, her hands continued to caress my nephew's body as though it was slowly putting a dry rub on a brisket. Then she did something I will never forget. She smiled at me. That smile was not filled with shark teeth. like some would think, but instead an almost human smile. The kind of smile someone's give when they know they're about to pull one over on you, and you can't do a damn thing about it. With sheer arrogance in her voice, she said to me, "You're next." As I saw her hand begin to lower onto my nephew while this was happening, her body seemed to get more and more visible as though she was becoming solid. Thinking fast, I needed to find a way out of this paralysis. I could have kicked myself for not realizing sooner, but the perfume must be the reason. So if it was a chemical reaction, then I have something for it. You see, I'm not the only one that can adjust their chemical composition, at least for a short while. Think of adjusting your brain to push off the effects of being drunk. Many people can do it, but it's a very temporary solution, and the headache that follows from it is very far from fun. Using this, it only took a few seconds for me to break out of the paralysis and be able to move freely again. I could see the utter terror in my nephew's eyes as she lifted her body in order to mount him. Sprinting from my position, I jumped onto her, causing us both to crash onto the floor. Being able to get her by surprise, I was able to take her back and get a quick choke on her. This proved difficult as her horns prevented me from getting my arm fully into position, though I did get my other arm around her neck. Remembering my old training, I dug my heels into her thighs. Good thing too, because my training never covered how to do this when somebody has extremely powerful wings. She tried to pull my arm away from her neck as she violently thrashed around with her wings. Her wings were so powerful that with each flap they bounced and crashed us around the room. As I was not used to doing jiu-jitsu against someone so thin, she was able to duck her jaw and bite down hard into my arm, so much so that I thought she was going to take a piece out. Grabbing her ear, I pulled enough that she screamed and lifted her head to try and alleviate the pain. This just allowed me to reset my arm into her neck. Now I got her, I thought, as I could feel her supple neck against my bicep muscle and forearm. The noise must have woke everyone because lights began to flip on as numerous people came running into the room, cursing and coming out as the children were picked up and rushed out of the room. My brother tried to help me subdue this thing, but the violent thrashing made that not possible. I suddenly found myself wishing that I had told them where I keep my firearms beside the safe. That is when the bitch truly got serious. She took her tail and penetrated me with it. Now, I've been shot, and I would rather do that 100 times over than experience the pain I went through at that moment. Then something happened I didn't think she was ready for. Instead of letting go, my muscles tightened, making it nearly impossible for her to breathe. As my legs tightened down, cracking her ribs, and I started cursing and using the Lord's name in vain. As I calmed down a little, I was saying, "Oh God, oh God, oh God!" And this made her begin to lose the strength she had. I'll admit, I was in far too much pain to know this until her body began to slump and she retracted her tail from my thigh. I looked at her in the eyes, and she looked at me with sheer contempt, asking me, "How could you have this power? You are no priest." I chuckled and told them that the army has authorized me to be recognized at the level of a deacon, even though the church only saw me as an altar server. The hate in her eyes at that point could have stopped the herd of elephants on meth. Moving my hand, not the one around her neck, but the one on her forehead, I began to demand her name. Of course, she wouldn't give it, so on to plan B. I began to pray to God and Jesus to cleanse this lost child and forgive her sins, free her from the shackles of this form, and bring her to faith as she enters your house. I continued as she began to thrash again, but this time getting weaker and weaker. This time my brother was able to help hold her down, and as I reached up to the end of my prayer, she screamed out her name. I demanded her true name as she looked at me with true fear for the first time. I placed my hand back on her head and I made the sign of the cross. This seemed to cause her even more pain as I demanded her true name. After a few moments, she said it. In truth, I expected something impossible for me to pronounce, though it was surprisingly easy. I will not say it here, but I will say that before I let my grip loosen, I tested it out with a silent prayer. Her reaction was a jolt, as though someone had just electrocuted her. Before releasing my grip, I used her name to command her to remain in her current form until I say otherwise. I picked her up, let her go, and placed her on the edge of the bed she was about to assault my nephew on. While my brother's wife and my sister patched me up, we inquired of the purpose she had in this house. She answered calmly as we finally got a really good look at her. Her naked body was like something you would see in a CGI model. Her proportions seemed to be slightly exaggerated, but not to a comic degree. Her tan and almost purple skin was flawless, minus the injury she had just occurred, of course. Her beautiful face, tight waistline, toned legs, and of course those perfectly formed breasts would make even those most chaste men think of impurity. The horns, though, similar to ram horns, were smooth to the touch, and almost silky smooth like her hair was as it went down her back. The wings, for being so freakishly strong, were rather thin and small given her size. I was having trouble figuring out how she could fly with them. Then there was that tail. That damn tail. Even the thought of it made my leg clench up a little bit. Though not a very long tail, it was clearly pure muscle. Looking at it again made me feel even more pain, kind of like a ghost pain, and I wanted to rip it off her pelvic bone. She did apologize for her actions, but that didn't make me feel any better. Going to need to pick up a donut later. Thanks a lot, lady. After getting the entire situation, I had to restrain my sister from going at this creature with a kitchen knife. It was her son that was nearly assaulted after all. Although, thanks to my brother's level-headed thinking, we came up with a better idea. Since she, as a demon, we made a deal. She would protect the family from harm whenever possible, along with keeping other demons at bay or far enough away where they didn't affect us. In return, the houses that the family lived in would become sanctuary to her, though every time she was present, she would have to make herself known to the family, though she would not have to reveal herself physically unless asked by one of the family. She would only take from the family that which is freely given and must repay with something of equal value. If another demon became a threat to her, she would simply need to bring us a name and we would aid her in protecting her from harm. In return, she would have free rein to punish those who have taken advantage of the family. All in all, a good, equitable deal. Excellent for both sides. Now, I wouldn't have made this deal without a little insurance. Since I know her true name, I can call her back whenever I need to. Though it is a very bad idea to push the boundaries of a deal like this, I'll still keep it in my back pocket, just in case. When everything was said and done, she stood up and walked to me. I asked her if she was ready to seal the contract, and she was. For those that don't know, if you're going to seal the contract with a succubus, you need to exchange fluids and, like any old leather, seal it with a kiss. Since she had bitten me, which I would need stitches for, as I could see the blood still coming out from the bandage, we had covered the first part. I gave her a quick kiss that she wanted. I made sure not to linger in order to make sure I didn't fall under her succubus sway. After this, we walked her to the back door and watched as she simply faded away as she walked through the threshold. That was almost 10 years ago now, and she's protected us from several things. Things like my niece almost getting into a car wreck, or my brother almost missing out on his daughter's birthday due to some asshole boss, even helping my nephew find a good girl to date and eventually got married to. She even comes to visit me when she needs a place to hide for a while, though I do have to keep telling her to put some frickin' clothes on. Not that I mind, but I have very large windows in this house. I can always tell when she goes after the buttholes, the bullies, the jerks, just royal pains in the butt within this town, and I just can't help but smile a little bit. Though I did have to laugh maniacally when she found out an ex-girlfriend was planning on hurting me on social media. Why? I found out she was cheating, and I kicked her to the curb for that. And when she was about to besmirch my name, no call to the police just to make me look like the biggest freak in this entire town. Well, let's just say nothing like a visit from a succubus while you're live streaming to get you banned. With all this, I just hope God doesn't mind that this family's guardian angel is no angel. Before my family got an angel that is definitely no angel, I had met a few people that seemed to prime me for my encounter with our new friend and guardian. Of course, not all of them were the type of help you would expect. In fact, not all of them were even still alive. You see, my parents moved shortly after I entered high school to their old new house. I guess they were trying to get back to nature or some such thing, moving all the way out there. This is where the family started dealing with the things that didn't make sense in this world. As I mentioned before, my sisters could hear things moving even though everyone was asleep. The dogs would be looking into certain rooms and just start growling for hours. It was until a year or so after we moved in that we found out one of the previous owners had ended himself in that house after a divorce. Suddenly, the one new wall in the living room made perfect sense. At this time, I was still an altar server at the local church, though I can't say I'm devout enough to be a priest. Not by a long shot, that is. But I still do my part. While there, I asked the priest if there was anything I could do to calm things down, as the noises and things were just constantly just getting worse, slowly over time. He instructed me what I could do, and it was quite simple, really. Going through each room of the house, attic to basement, or the other way around, would help if I did a proper exorcism, that is. While I did so, I could actually feel the tension as I went from room to room in a constant prayer. By the time I had gotten to the final room, I could feel something fighting me every step as though something was going to hurt me if I continued. As I performed the sign of the cross, I could feel the dread, tension, and malice drain from the area. I informed the priest of this before his visit, and he even said the house was clear before he even opened his bag. There was a bit of confusion in his eyes, or something else. Thinking back, I might have been taken by the church if he was still alive by the time I came of age. Later on, at my first job, there was a young woman that claimed to be a Satanist. Though this wasn't much of the thing she talked about, gave me a little insight on the more paranormal side of things. When I went to college, I met the one that really let me know what was up. On our first date, she claimed to be a witch, and even said she agreed to go out with me because she felt something when we were close. At that time, I chalked it up to late teen hormones, but that was before she did something weird. After talking for a few hours, she asked me if she could conduct an experiment, and being a dumb kid, I always said, "Sure." She took my hands, and she asked me to calm my mind as best I could and relax. I thought this was going to go to where we started making out or something, but something very different happened. I began to see, with my eyes closed, a long, dark tunnel. At least that's what it looked like. Distant stars all around me flying by, not too dissimilar to what you see on the sci-fi shows. This only looked at for a few seconds before I could see myself walking through a forest. I could kind of see people to my left and right, dressed in old brown uniforms. I didn't know if it was World War I or II at the time, but I just kept walking through the forest with this light coming through the undergrowth. Without warning, I could see the flashes from the muzzle of a full automatic machine gun, and almost in slow motion, I could feel the pain of a large caliber bullet hit me in the upper left chest. Knowing that I do now, I would have caused a collapse of a lung if not treated. But that wasn't the last thing I saw. Still, In sort of slow motion, the impact threw me back, forcing my head to the lower as well. The blood shot out of the hole it left by the bullet and seemed to launch a gourd 4 or 5 inches out of my chest. Still looking down, I could see the rifle come up out of my hands I didn't even realize I was carrying. Thinking about it, it looked like a type of bolt-action rifle. I don't know, but it clearly wasn't a carbine or a Thompson. I can tell you that. In that moment, she jumped back, breaking contact with my hands, and I fell back off the chair and flat on my back. Jumping up, I started checking to see if I was actually shot. Once I saw I was clean, I looked over at her as she lay on her side, curled up in the fetal position on my bed. I was still catching my breath from the shock as I asked her why she was crying. Her only response was, "I just watched you die," which was more than enough to give me pause. We tried to make sense of the experience, but soon enough moved on to other things. On other dates, she would teach me about how witches operate and that not all of them are actually bad. As she put it, it depends on how you manipulate energy, which made me totally lost. I mean, I know my basic physics, but that went right over my head. Though, to put it simply, many witches do not want to put the time in to gain power over time in order to use it. Many simply try to steal power in other forms, or from animals to give a quick jump up to the higher levels of powers. They do this without understanding that even in the paranormal, there is cause and effect. Although I could just say, karma's a bitch, to hammer that point home. This is why the more evil the witch, the more is taken from them, and the less that they remain human. She didn't mind putting the work in if it meant keeping her safe from the things that might do her harm, though I still couldn't get her to carry a knife to aid in the endeavor. Especially when we found out a universal truth about the kind of things she was researching. Any type of creature that has the ability to cross over to our physical reality has to follow the same rules as us in the physical world. In this revelation, we realize that once a being is trying to physically harm you, it can be harmed as well, or even killed by the same means as anything else. This made us wonder why anyone would run from these kinds of things when they come for you. The answer escaped us for a long time, but it was obvious that I actually hit myself in the head when I figured it out. It was the simple fight or flight instinct kicking in, just like if a gator jumped out of the water and then you were there, you didn't see it. Few people would even think about fighting something like that, let alone something they have never even seen before. Though there was one caveat to this, and that was the fact that they were still tethered to the astral plane. This means that the faithful still wield power that can hurt, incapacitate, or even end creatures that are crossing over. This led us to the only cryptid hunt that I have ever been on. If you were wondering why I would agree to this, just remember I was about 18 or 19 and she was my first real girlfriend. A petite, little, pale, pretty little thing. And pretty much had me going whatever she wanted. Yep, we all been there once. We got a few of her friends together. Mine didn't want anything to do with this even when I offered them to get the beer, and headed to a location that was known to be a hot spot for cryptids. The town itself was nearly abandoned, and the few remaining residents were just waiting for their checks to clear before they could leave. Being an old manufacturing town, there was a lot of old factory buildings to explore on the far side. Over the past few years, several people reported seeing creatures that seemed to move in the shadows, that had a penchant for stealing pets and the occasional person. Most people outside the town would just think that the person moved out, but the folks in town seemed to think different. When we stopped to get drinks and snacks at the local fuel station, a few of the kids inquired about the cryptid. The guy behind the counter had a big smile when we came in, but that dropped off his face in a second when we asked him anything that he might have seen. He was hesitant for a while, but a few well-placed bills and some flirting from the girls got him to open up. He told us where it had been seen the most, but warned us that others had gone to find it and not everyone came back. One story stuck in my mind was about a group of 6 going to the area, and the next day the only thing left was their gear, their car, and some blood. From that point, most people stayed away. One of the more alpha guys in our group shrugged it off. Scary old man. Now which way is it? I shot him a look as my hand rubbed the knife hanging off my belt. He saw this and retreated outside while we apologized, paid for our items, and left. You would think the area we were going would be far outside town, but nope. It took us less than 5 minutes to be pulling up into this overgrown parking lot next to a facility. As I stepped out, my senses were suddenly on high alert, along with one of another in our group. She was new to the group, but seemed to be even more sensitive to this stuff than me. So much so that she almost had to be dragged inside as we looked around. The place was exactly what you would expect from an old factory. Machinery was setting and rusting, and the place smelled horrible. More than half of the windows had either been busted out or were falling off. Judging from the wood and the style of construction of the place, it had been at least 50 years old, at least. I was beginning to worry about the structural integrity of the place more than anything else we might find in there. The smell of urine, feces, old burned oil, mold, and God knows what else made us glad the windows were more than half busted. Although it was still strong enough smell that we had to step out in the open air more than once. While a few of us looked around for any critters that might be dangerous, and others set up their circle in hopes of drawing out what they thought was there. The candles seemed to help with the smell as the flames burned off some of the more pungent odors. It was about an hour after we got there that they started their chants. Now, this is where it would have been really nice to know what the hell we were searching for. I knew there was something to be worried about, just something. But I had no idea why the hairs on the back of my neck were standing straight up. Without even knowing it, my hand had grasped the handle of my knife, which was a 7.5-inch solid chunk stainless steel, while the other was on my flashlight looking around. But then it had gotten dark, and looking back, I would have killed somebody for some night vision. On the other side of my belt was the old 1911 my father had purchased for me. It was well after midnight as they still chanted. Still. It was to the point I was wondering if their voices would actually hold out. It was then that we heard glass break and a car alarm go off. It only took a few seconds for us to react and to run outside and look. We got there just as something big and dark ran from the van, just right in front of us, about maybe 30 feet, and disappeared into the night. It wasn't until that point that I realized we might be up against something truly dangerous. I looked at the other guys, and we backed into the center where the chanting was continuing. We backed into the center so that the candles would give us some additional light. Without thinking, those of us with firearms drew them and held them as the way those TV cops do, hand over with a flashlight underneath. The lights moved rapidly around as we could hear things moving around. Those chanting kept going, though I don't know if it was out of fear or desperation. When we saw something moving and we turned our weapons at it, this thing seemed to take shape from the shadows. As it moved in its silent glide towards the circle, this thing was not the same thing we saw outside. This thing was not from the physical plane. One of the guys put his hands up and motioned for us to lower our pistols while saying, "That's not going to work." And he was right. This thing had not reached the point of physical yet, which means we can't hurt it. It reached out to the group and seemed to be stopped by the cold, by the circle of salt and other materials that surrounded us. It slowly pressed itself against the side of the circle, seemingly spreading itself like a giant ink blot or against the sides, The one that had stopped us from shooting started holding his hands up and praying in a language I didn't understand. Next to me was another guy with a pistol, and he just said, Jikiniki. I recognized that and asked, aren't they Japanese? To which he just shrugged. Hearing the young man pray reminded me of what I could do. Putting my pistol away, I started to pray too. Using the Lord's Prayer, I forced it to recede back into its original size. In fact, though I don't know if it was just me, the damn thing seemed to lose all ability to stay upright. Its body seemed to slump down and lay on its side, though it seemed to be trying to reach the darkness, the shadows that it came from. This is when the chanting changed. I don't know what they were saying. My Latin is terrible. But the change of the chant seemed to weaken it even more, to the point that my girlfriend turned to us and said, Now you can kill it. It was still reaching for the shadows, but didn't seem to have the ability to go back into them. In fact, had it been severed from its power? And now it was easy prey? As I unclenched, I reached for my pistol and we received a shock. Without warning, something massive dropped down right on top of it and seemed to rip it clean in half. For a moment, I thought it was a giant black bear, at least until it turned its head to us. Those deep, yellow eyes looked at us with both thanks and malice. In its mouth was the center of that shadow, being as the shadow seemed to slowly disintegrate as it dripped away from its mouth. The other two parts of the shadow seemed to do the same, as it seemed to be almost evaporated in a matter of seconds. We might have just dealt with something that was not of this world, but it seems it didn't change gears. This cryptid was going to have us for dinner. Literally. We didn't think at that point, as both pistols rang out into the night. My quick draw might not be great, but there was no way I'm missing something that big at that range. Before most of us could blink, it had jumped back into the darkness, and both pistols needed to be reloaded. A few tried to start chanting again, but it was my turn to tell them that's not going to work. As I released the slide of my .45, I still remembered the release from the other guy's 9mm as we looked at each other and seemed to talk without saying a word. We got nearly back to back as we searched the area for that big bastard. We could hear it moving around as my girlfriend got up to stand next to me. I used my free hand to draw my knife and hand it to her. She actually looked at me and said, "I don't like knives." Where I retorted, "I'm not asking," while shoving the handle into her hand. We could hear it moving around us. In fact, it sounded almost as though there was more than one. Thankfully, one of the girls had a father who was a police officer. She could tell that it was staying up in the rafters while throwing stuff down at us to confuse us. To this day, I'm impressed at how calm she was, because I was about ready to piss my pants. It must have hurt her, because it came running into the light near her. We fired at it as soon as we got it in view. Apparently, it can't remain stealthy when it's charging. My 7 bullets and his 15 were almost deafening as we fired a full magazine into it as it charged. Though it was clearly hurt, the damn thing was still able to slash the girl that had figured this mutt out. Even though the cuts weren't too deep, she still needed her wounds tended to. Call us dumb kids if you want, but we did bring a first aid kit with us. With both weapons now reloading again with their final magazines, my heart was beating through my sternum. I wouldn't be surprised if they could see it. But I'm sure the others were just as scared of this thing as I was. It was smart. Really smart. And it had taken 4 magazines of bullets and barely even slowed down. I know I had hit it in the face at least once, since it did scream in pain when I shot it. But at that moment I was wondering if I had enough ammo left to even take this thing down. My girlfriend had removed her top to put pressure on the girl's wounds. I know she wasn't all that shy, but I wonder if they could have used anything else to stem the bleeding. That is when I heard the most odd sound. It was like rapid breathing mixed with a half cough coming from the darkness. The guy next to me cursed and fired in the direction he thought it was. When I asked, "What are you doing?" he responded, "That son of a bitch is laughing at us." Without skipping a beat, the girl on the ground, bleeding, looked up and said, "I don't think calling a werewolf a son of a bitch is a very good insult." I regret not thanking her for the chuckle we were all desperately in need of at the moment. Once he thought about the insult, he ripped out some new ones, which were quite colorful. Now, I don't know if this thing was mad or what, but it wasn't hiding anything as it charged again. This time, it backhanded the two of us, shooting us across as we unloaded on it. I could see blood spurt out of the holes from my bullets, but it didn't seem to care. The massive arm swung, hitting the other shooter first and knocking him out and knocking me over. As it kept going, it reached out with its other hand and grabbed my girlfriend and bounded into the darkness. She was screaming as I scrambled to my feet, screaming her name into the darkness. I could hear her screeching as I got up and ran into the darkness after her. The others were yelling at me to stay, but I was gone before they could even think of stopping me. Her screams were still inside the factory, but getting farther away by the moment. As I stumbled through the darkness to where I could hear her screaming, I could feel that the slide was locked back, meaning I was out of ammo. I paused for just a moment as I thought about what I could do, and that is when I heard it. The wolf howled in clearly in pain-filled manner. Under the howl was my girlfriend screaming at it, cursing. At least I knew she was still alive. That is when I remembered a good luck charm my uncle had given me. I quietly said, "Duh," as I reached into my shirt and pulled the silver cartridge. Ripping it from the chain, I prayed that it was the right size. Good thing he's a .45 guy like me. I put the bullet into the magazine, shoved the magazine in the pistol before hearing something I really didn't want to hear. It sounded like tearing and my girl screaming in fear. Taking off again, I chambered the round and then realized it might be a dummy round. But hearing everything going on, my body was moving before my mind could even process. Before reaching the far side of the factory, her cries had stopped. At that moment, desperation disappeared and rage took its place. The dim light of my flashlight leading the way into the final destination. Turning the corner to the only noise on that side of the factory, I saw something that instantly burned its way into my mind. This massive thing was holding her down and assaulting her the way no one should ever be assaulted. He was above her in a way that her head was almost perfectly leaned back and facing me. She wasn't making noise, and her eyes were fixed as her body moved back and forth. In that moment, I didn't know if that was the look of pleasure, pain, or shock, and in any case, I couldn't think. That bastard just looked up at me, and as soon as I turned the corner, it laughed again. I don't remember thinking. All I know is I raised the pistol and pulled the trigger. Even after the round went off, I kept pulling again and again and again, as though it would make another bullet magically enter the chamber and fire out. The bullet struck this thing in the chest, and it fell back and started screeching in pain. It jumped up, or at least tried to, as the knife sticking out of its upper thigh made it difficult, and then it ran off, yelping and screaming in pain. Silently, I thanked my uncle for that silver bullet, even though he wasn't around anymore, before going to my girl. I used my shirt to cover her as best as I could and tried to make it back to the group. I say try because when I shot that thing, I dropped the flashlight, and that seemed to severely lower the amount of light coming out. The flashlight died before we got back to the group, unfortunately, but I could still see the light in the distance. Walking up to them, I told them what happened, and since the very first glimmer of daylight was coming, we decided to get the hell out of there. Though with the damage to the van, it would be another hour before we could even get on our way. Once we jerry-rigged the van, we headed to the fuel station to get parts we needed to make it back to civilization. When we walked in there was nobody behind the counter, but the lights were still on and the door was open. We grabbed what we needed, threw some cash on the counter, went to work on the van. As we did, two SUVs pulled up and tried to get fuel. They didn't say anything until one walked up to the busted side of the van. He pulled off the small clump of fur and called for his buddies. I didn't know if they were just well-mannered or that they saw that at least two of us were armed, but they were very polite as they asked if we had a rough night. Even back then, I could smell government on someone, so I was quiet at first, but that was a wrong answer. One of the girls told them about the run-in with the monster, but they said they were here to stop it. They produced badges I had never ever seen before, or since for that matter, and claimed that they were sent to stop the threat. I told them to, really, you gotta prove it. They slammed open the door to the van, showing them the wounded. This put them in high gear as they produced very large and very full medical bags. It was clear that they knew what they were doing while the others started probing us for questions. We told them everything we could on the contingent that they would get our wounded to a hospital and fast as possible. Since this was before cell phones were a thing, they called on the radio and had a helicopter landed in less than 10 minutes. Damn thing must have been close. With those two taken care of, we told the men everything down to the last finite detail. By the time we were done explaining, their polite dispositions had changed into an extremely professional demeanor. I could see that they had rage in their eyes, like me, and before they left, I ran over to one of I thought might have been in charge and said, "Hey, when you find that shit stain, make it hurt." He just looked at me, saw the look in my eyes, nodded, and they left, tearing out of the station in the direction of the factory. The rest of us didn't talk the entire hour ride back. It would be over a week before I saw the cop's daughter back in class. Our conversation was limited to a quick check on each other's health and wondering how my girl was doing. Since this was before social media, we couldn't get any information at all. When I tried to call her parents, they didn't want to talk to me and blamed me for everything. They only yelled about how I was supposed to protect their daughter. At that point, all I could do was carry on. About 2 weeks after the horror ordeal, I received a package in the mail. I wasn't expecting anything this close to the end of the semester, so I was curious. Inside was a freshly cleaned stainless steel knife, a mangled silver bullet, and a letter. The letter said that my girl had put up one hell of a fight. The blade was still in the wolf when they caught up to it. She must have listened to that movie when they said, "Stick it in his thigh and twist it so the wound won't close." Even though she had heard it, the additional assault had messed her up mentally, like really bad. So much so that she was being remanded to a psych facility on the other side of the country. Even though I knew where it was, they wouldn't accept any letters or gifts until she was stable. When that will be, nobody knew. The next part I remember perfectly. Quote, "The silver you put into it didn't hit anything vital, but it was deep enough that it couldn't cut the bullet out with its claws. Due to its effects on the wolf, when they caught up to it, it was like fighting something that had a horrible flu and had not eaten anything or drank anything in like a day. You can rest assured that after we found him, we confronted him for his actions. When we mentioned the girl, he smiled as though he was proud. Though our orders are to bring these things in alive, if that's at all possible, this one will never bother anyone again. Whatever hell it is now is probably nicer than the last few days of its life. By the way, if you ever want a job, just call the number on the bottom." I would only ever call once. I actually burned the letter an hour later, after I put the knife back into its sheath and found a place for the bullet. The bullet would stay there until I made another one I would still keep, just in case. After a few years, I was finally able to find out what happened to my witch girlfriend. I got tired of the runaround from the hospital and called the number on the letter. It turns out she didn't make it. The news nearly broke me. But at the time, I was getting ready for my first deployment and others were counting on me, so I had to stay strong. I had left college when I saw the towers fall and joined like so many others, so I didn't have much time to search on what happened to her. At least, not until a few years ago. These are not good memories of my past, but they did prepare me to deal with the strange things I would see in my life. Not the least of which is tapping on my front door right now. I know it's her since she thinks it's cute to just use one finger, no matter how many times I ask her to use the doorbell. I guess I'll go now. Be careful and be ready to deal with all the things that go bump in the night, whether you want them to or not. Well, I just had a visit from my family's guardian. Well, actually, the visit isn't over. She's currently asleep in one of the guest rooms. Tomorrow, when I wake her up, I can only hope she remembers to wear a t-shirt I gave her to wear. I really do not need another visit from the sheriff because the school bus that stopped right in front of us, for the kid across the street that was, and the bus saw a naked woman standing in the living room waving at the kids. Ugh. That would have been much more difficult to explain if she didn't come out of the shower when the sheriff was talking to me and right past the doorway in order to get a clean towel. And when the sheriff couldn't pull his eyes away from her for even a second, but, well, I guess he understood the situation. At least he thinks he understands the situation. My heart sank to my feet when I realized that she was in view of him and standing right behind me. But when I spun around, all I could see that she was a completely human supermodel reaching into the linen closet. I could have gone without her drying herself off while talking to him, but as long as things got settled, I wasn't going to complain too much. I swear, that woman just loves to torture me any chance she can. It gets really mad when she shows up to Netflix and chill. Although I did get her back a little bit when I just grabbed a couple of beers and snacks and proceeded to watch the movie without even making a move. Hell, not even touching her. I could see on her face that, for a succubus, this was beyond frustrating. Don't get me wrong. Had she been human, I would have made a move during the opening credits. I mean, that lean, athletic form would make any man wonder how flexible she just might be. However, I know what would happen if I gave in to such temptations. It wouldn't matter what our deal is, I would potentially become her slave, manservant, whatever the hell you want to call it. I know she doesn't like taking slaves. It's not really what she does. But it's just not worth taking the risk. Last night we spoke about what we would have both been up to for the past few months while she was away. I've been pretty much focused on my work and, of course, my side jobs, so there really wasn't much to say outside of that. My work may be interesting to me, but for others it's pretty boring. So I just listened to what she'd been up to, and she's been busy. Turns out there's a new fad of summoning demons. I chuckled at this idea since I thought she was just joking. She was completely serious about it, so my attention was immediately piqued and locked onto her. She actually started with, "Thank God for social media. Those idiots will do anything for likes and views, even summon me, or even my mother." This one made me pause, since I knew she had been born a succubus, but nothing I had read about talked about their families. Hell, I didn't even think that this was the way demons were born. She told me that her mother was a much stronger succubus and had her father stay away a lot of the time, yet called him back on occasion for his, uses. I asked for a picture, so using some sort of magic, she created a 3D image of her mom. She looked like a cross between a true demon and an exceedingly voluptuous woman. Her horns turned down inside and upside down and all this other fun stuff, while her skin was a deep red and the wings and her tail were far larger than my guardian. Instead of the dark green I am used to in her eyes, they were dark blue, like serious dark blue. Again, there was no black pupils in them at all, just like her daughter. The major difference was the long talons on her hands and feet. They looked like that of a predator that was used to dropping onto its prey and holding them down. I mean, this stood to good reason, I guess, when you think about it. We finished up talking about her mother and that "I would like you to meet her one day" line. That, oh boy, when she said that, that line made me a little bit unnerved. So I changed the subject back to the whole demon summoning. As it turns out, most people don't have the slightest idea how to do it. Just like reading a certain chemical reaction to make a product, you need to have all the right elements in place or else the summoning just doesn't work. Usually demons can hear the summons, but if not done right, they don't have to answer. When they do, it's almost always in the wrong type of demon. She told me how she got summoned to a location where a young woman was trying to contact her father that had passed. When I asked her what she did, she responded with how she made the woman feel better. Okay. Though when I shook my head, she told me that she just kneeled down next to the woman and held her. Since it was an incomplete summons, the woman couldn't see her, but she could hear the breathing and, of course, feel the hug. I asked, then, was it? And got a response, that was enough. I snacked on her emotion and she left off, and it was so sweet, I didn't want to sour it. I left that one alone right there. She brought up how, when done right, a summons can suddenly yank a demon out of whatever they're doing at that moment. It works for angels too, believe it or not. This is pretty much the reason why so many are pissed off when they arrive. I did have to chuckle a little bit about that, seriously, who would want to be taking a dump and then all of a sudden reappear in someone else's house? The one that made both of us laugh out loud was some rich kid wanted to summon a demon to take out his parents so he could inherit the estate at a young age. The moron ended up summoning two incubus that demanded payment. I asked, they didn't. She smiled and said, "You bet his ass they did." While trying to keep my dinner down at that mental image, I asked her how she knew. As it turns out, she was summoned as well, along with 5 other demons of different characteristics. The incubus were of the highest level of that group, and would have been able to tear everyone else to pieces that tried to stop them. So they had little choice just to sit and wait till everything was finished. Once the 2 were done, they said they would take good care of his parents before moving along. 3 of the demons were the type that wanted to make a deal with. To no surprise, he was in no shape mentally to make any sort of deals. Definitely had to change the subject after that one. She would tell me more later, but those really get messed up. So we reminisced on what she had done to help the family. I had to open a bottle of wine before she started since I had run out of beer in the fridge. Yeah, I'm not a big drinker. Sue me. Where we talked about how my niece used to drive way too fast. For months I had told her to slow down, but she didn't listen. Come on, she was a teenager. Though one day she was about to back out of her parents' driveway and saw my guardian sitting in the back seat of the rearview mirror. I would have almost paid to see the shocked look on her face at the moment she looked in that mirror. She told me that after the shock, she moved into the front seat and told my niece that she would get hurt if she drove so recklessly. Then again, tell a teenager she's doing something wrong and watch the explosion happen in slow motion. When my niece told her to go away, she did, only to appear again when my niece was texting while driving. She screamed at my niece, "Look out!" And that caused her to look up and see she was about to drive into an intersection. By the way, she was about to run a red light, too. When the car screamed to a stop, she missed being hit by a dump truck barely a few feet away. When I was in South Korea, we called those things Terminators for good reason. The only difference between here and there is that over here, drivers will actually stop after the collision to see if you're okay or even in one piece. I remember the call vividly as my niece was explaining what had just happened. Since she was closer to my place, she ended up spending the night. In fact, both of them stayed together here all night. I tried to comfort her, but my niece was still shaking as she tried to go to sleep. I guess holding on to a supermodel with wings helped her because she was back to herself the next day. By then, I had set up her phone to send one of those automated messages telling people to text later while she was driving. I'm sure she got plenty of shit from her friends about the new standard on her phone, but at least she didn't have to worry about crashing through an intersection again. As a thank you to our guardian, I spent a lot of money and cooked her absolute favorite meal. Well, cooked it as in relative terms in this case. A 42-year-old bottle of wine, raw oysters, a really exotic salad with things I wouldn't even have thought of, the best and finest steak I could get covered in truffles and artichokes, charcoal grilled while basted in honey, and for dessert the richest chocolate cake I could make with a cinnamon latte for a drink. It didn't take much research to find out why she enjoyed this meal. I would like to say the evening ended there with us curled up on the couch watching Deadpool, of all things, which she loves, and slowly falling asleep as I held on to her. I really, really want to say that. But the tapping on the window made me awake in a fraction of a second. When I raised my head up, I could barely see anything due to the fact that the TV was the only source of light. However, it wasn't the only one on guard now. My guardian had her eyes locked onto the window when I turned to look at her. Without thinking too much, I got up and walked to the shelf on the wall furthest from the window. The tapping continued as I reached up and touched the hidden switch on the shelf. It dropped open and exposed my Thompson M1. Without hesitation, I swung it around towards the window, placing it tight into my shoulder and pulling back the bolt, making it ready to fire. This didn't stop the tapping, but it did bring a kind of laughing from the outside. Not a belly-type laugh, but more like a deep chuckle. It was creepy. It kept going on until I reached into the compartment where the submachine gun was and pulled out a small note that I had taped to the top. I held it up and the laughing immediately stopped along with the laughing. The guardian actually went pale as she read the message on that piece of cardboard I had written, "Consecrated silver bullets," big enough to be read with ease from the window. With my finger on the trigger, I moved across the room to the front door, right next to the large window. Through my training, I kicked in fully and still moved slowly and carefully as I reached for the light. I didn't reach for the switch to turn on the living room lights, but instead reached for the switch to turn on the porch light. When I did, I saw something I just wasn't expecting. Standing on my porch was a dragon. A freaking dragon. It was a full dragon man hybrid anthropomorphic of something of sorts. Now, this was a little difficult to describe, so bear with me. The head was almost fully reptilian, like you would think of a dragon in the movies, and it was bowed down a little bit with seeming green type cat eyes and what seemed like smoke coming off its nose and ears, at least where the ears should be. I couldn't see any. Its neck wasn't much bigger than a human's, and its shoulders looked mostly human. Well, they did if you discount the scales that seemed to cover about 60% of them. The musculature of the chest and arms was an amalgamation of human and reptilian, with 5-fingered claws for its hands. It was clear that it held kind of an 8-pack set of abdominal muscles, which made perfect sense when you realize that its torso was a bit long for its size. The legs were an amalgamation as well, yet the strength of them could clearly be seen as they almost seemed to flex as they stood looking at me. His feet were not set up like humans, but instead adjusted so that they almost looked like he was standing on his toes. All this with a giant spur on the back of his, I guess you'd say, ankle? I could make out the movement of a tail behind him, similar to my guardian, but the most prominent part were the wings. Oh God, the wings. The wings were so large that they were spread out to fit under the porch ceiling, and yet they still were bent to fit. I still had my weapon up when a female voice behind me started yelling at the top of her lungs to stop. She flipped on the living room light and it reached for the door. I stopped her by grabbing her arm, which seemed to make the dragon thing just a bit agitated. She screamed at me, "Let me go! That's my daddy!" Which, even after all I had seen, truly baffled my mind. When I let her go, she swung open the door and ran into his arms. I was still holding my weapon, but lowered it when this thing hugged her back in a way a loving father does to his daughter. I moved to the doorway, without crossing the threshold, to listen to them talk. I only got a bit of what they were saying, since they kept changing languages. Now, I know a few languages myself, but the way they kept changing languages and dialects made it nearly impossible to keep up. Though I did get the gist of it, and what they were just trying to catch up a bit from what I could tell. Eventually, they turned to me, and she introduced me to him. At least, I think she did, since she was still speaking in a language I didn't know. She stood next to him and motioned in a way that made me think she was talking about me directly. All I could really do was just stand there and wait. So I did. For nearly an hour, I just stood there and listened to them talk, catching a few words and phrases each minute or two. Eventually, they turned and addressed me. She asked me if her father could come inside, but one look at his wings and I knew he was barely even going to get in the door. So I offered him to grab him a couple of beers, which I forgot I didn't have, and grabbed a lighter to start the fire pit. I remembered at that point that I had kept a couple of cases in the basement just for company that I forgot about, since I'm not a drinker myself, so I could just grab a full case and call it good. I met them in the back by the fire pit and got it going with a few squirts of lighter fluid. Keeping my M1 slung across my back, I sat down on the opposite side of the fire from the dragon. Unfortunately for me, that meant I got a few good looks at why my guardian's mother wanted him as a mate. It helped that they were both went back to speaking English, or I would have been completely lost again. The dragon asked me about myself and what I had planned. I didn't get what he was talking about, a future relationship with his daughter, until 10 minutes later. I tried to dodge the subject for a while until I was about 4 beers deep. That's when I admitted I didn't have the slightest clue about it, since our situation was what it is. He threw me back by saying, "It's normal for slaves to fall in love with their masters. You just have to accept what she is and following her orders. It isn't that difficult to figure out now that you belong to her." She and I looked at each other confused, and I could see the light bulb go off in her eyes. She turned to him and told him of our situation, and I could see the anger coming from him. I know that look and that posture of a man. This was the look of a man that was on the verge of doing something really stupid. When she finished, he turned to me and got to his feet. Without hesitation, I pulled the weapon from my back and aimed it at his face. The safety was off, and my finger was on the trigger. He looked at me and saw the conviction in my eyes. That is when he smiled and said, "I like this one," before sitting back down. When he did, she told him how that I had given her sanctuary and kept a couple of the other demons off her back. In one case, literally. This seemed to calm him down more, but I was still glad I didn't invite him into the house. The rules for demons are just as solid as the rules of physics, so I knew I couldn't underestimate this guy. The night ended with him saying his goodbyes and giving me the dad look before going away. He was barely got 10 feet off the ground before his body seemingly dissolved in midair. I swear I will never get used to that. My guardian wanted to stay outside and enjoy the night air some more before going to sleep. I agreed and dropped a final piece of wood on the fire before relaxing in the chair, and for the moment, I forgot I still had a succubus with me. Less than a minute later, she had gotten up and climbed into my chair with me. That slender body seemed to curl up like a cat as she nuzzled herself into my arms. While she sat there, I asked her how she got me out of legal trouble. To set the stage, I had a girlfriend a few months that was far too clingy. At first, I thought she was just inexperienced about dating, but I was wrong. Eventually, she tried to move herself into my house, claiming residency, and started demanding that I change everything about the way I live my life to fit her life instead. It all came to a head when she saw me go out for my morning run and she came over to cook me breakfast. I should have known this was bad when she had no ingredients and she said she would make something with what was available. When I came back, not only was breakfast burned and inedible, but she decided to reorganize the entire kitchen. In the process, she broke my blender and my slow cooker was in the trash. Remembering what an old friend told me, I left the room, turned on my cell phone to record, and came back quietly and asked, "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" She tried to play this whole innocent facade until I fished my slow cooker out of the trash and cut my hand on the broken pieces of blender. When I told her she was wrong for doing this while holding the cooker, she cooked the damn thing out of my hand and crashed it on the ground. I told her to get out, and she left screaming about how she was going to get me arrested as she started knocking things around. When she finally left, I pulled out my phone and realized that it had stopped recording after 5 minutes. Oh crap. I cursed as I saved the little bit of recording I had. When I turned it off, I asked, "So, how long have you been watching?" Without skipping a beat, my guardian said, "Oh, I wouldn't miss this moment for anything," as she grinned and walked over in front of me. Her grin faded when I told her that if the crazy bitch calls the police, then I would be arrested and charged without evidence. She was confused because justice is done differently where she comes from. Realizing this was serious, she asked if I request assistance from her family guardian. Of course, I said yes, but when I asked how, she just laughed and told me to log onto my ex's live stream. I did, after making throwaway account, of course. I got one hell of a show. Now, if you don't know what to look for, you miss what's going on. But the simple version is this. As she ranted about how bad I was, she began to tell about what happened. Now, after she said the words, "He walked in the room," everything was wrong. As she talked about items kept moving, falling, or blowing across her closed room. At first, she barely noticed things like her lamp moving down on its own, which she must have thought was a loose screw or something. However, things kept ramping up every time she started talking. While this was going on, I could see the shapes moving around, and yes, that was plural. Watching in amusement as they did things to blow her ear, knock items off her dresser, and slowly open the closet door. Now, they didn't do anything too crazy, or else she would have just turned off the stream and left. They played it smart, and soon, when she was in shock just enough, they moved on to phase 2. I saw shapes get close to her, and I started to laugh. I knew that look in her eyes. That was the look she got when somebody went south of 8 Mile on her. She said her goodbye on the stream and thought she had turned it off. I didn't know if they had messed with her side of the screen, but the rest of us still had full access as the shorts came off immediately. Pretty soon, the top followed, and there was a breaking of tons of rules for the site she was on, which was a gaming site, by the way, and I could see several shapes and positions that made her noise levels, shall we say, appropriate. Needless to say, she was banned for life after that, and I dropped off all her stuff to her apartment right before getting a restraining order. holding my guardian in my arms as she described getting the incubuses, yes, more than one, and getting them to go full hog on my ex during the day was interesting. Like I said before, they all have rules they need to follow, and working in the daylight without a summons can be an issue. The incubus agreed because they knew I had my guardian's back, and she told them that they could drain this crazy lady dry since she was just not a nice person. That was why that bitch collapsed on the floor once everything was done. Suddenly makes sense. I would have to thank the incubus, if I ever see him, for getting me out of a lot of trouble. After doing what they did, she must have been asleep a full day, which gave me enough time to pack all her things, drive to the police station, and the town hall. By this point in the night, my guardian was getting a little too tired to stay awake. Physical properties and all, as she was still in the physical plane. I picked her up and placed her in a chair while I took care of the fire. At first, she wouldn't let go, so I slipped out of my t-shirt to put it on her. I don't know if it was the residual heat or the smell, but she seemed interested and relaxed a bit and allowed me to take care of the fire. After pouring the last of the beer onto the flames and putting the flames out, of course, and I turned back and couldn't believe how cute this demon looked on my shirt, just curled up like in the chair like a cat. I chuckled before picking her up and carrying her into the guest room. That damn tail wrapped around my arm while I carried her inside, and I had to be careful to peel it off my arm before I could put the sheet over her. Now here I am, writing down my time with her since I don't know if I will be around much longer. What I didn't tell them is that I could understand some of the conversation between her and her father. There was something happening on the other side, and it was something strange on the other side of the veil. It's difficult to describe in detail, but there's something going on. Something is drawing demonic beings into a confrontation between different higher-ranking demons, though I did hear them say something about angels as well, but my grasp on the situation is tenuous at best. All I can do right now is protect my own. I have to, since something keeps activating the motion lights outside. I have my M1 right next to me, and I swapped out the ball rounds of my pistol to something with a little more fire. With all this, maybe I should look into what else I can do to protect the house. Now, if you'll excuse me, I can hear my guardian moving around. I need to go check to see if everything's all right. After all the excitement of the previous night, I decided to stay awake for a while as I really couldn't sleep anyway. Eventually, I heard my guardian stirring, so I went in to check on her. When I walked into the room, I saw my guardian curled up in the corner of the room, clutching the blankets around her. She looked like a scared child that has seen the boogeyman, Baba Yaga, as she stared at the window. I looked at the window, but I couldn't see anything outside. The motion light was on, and I could see all the way to the neighbor's house. I walked up to the window and looked closer. Still nothing. That's when she screamed, "Don't open the window!" I stopped and turned to her. The fear in her eyes was at a new level now. I kept looking back to the window and then back to her, but I still couldn't see what she could see. I asked, "What is it?" She responded in a shaky voice, "Angels. Hunter angels." Her voice was now reaching the point where I knew she would piss herself soon. I still couldn't see anything, but I did hear something. I could hear what sounded like the movement of wings. They sounded large and so incredibly quiet, almost that of an owl's wings. It was almost like listening to that owl in flight as it went back and forth from in front of the window. Nearly silent, though just enough movement to be noticed by those listening close. Moving around to her, I became the new guardian. I wrapped my arms around her and picked her up, rotating her so that her back was to the window. She was shaking uncontrollably as I held her there. She kept her head on my shoulder and wrapped her arms, legs, and tail around me so tight I was wondering when I would hear my ribs crack. Even after a few minutes, she was still shaking hard enough that my kidneys were being hurt. I tried to comfort her and slowly stroking her hair, which was still silky smooth, and telling her, "It's all right, and you're safe." Eventually I asked, "What did you see?" hoping the past tense would help calm her a little. With a shaky voice, she said, "Angels. Hunter angels." I was curious, so I asked, "What are hunter angels?" She took a deep breath before answering, "They're angels who carry holy weapons." Taking another deep breath, "They come to take us away if we're lucky." Confused, I asked, "Lucky?" Still stuttering, "If you're not lucky, they'll end you. It is, oh God, oh God." She started shaking even harder now, and she began to have a full-blown panic attack. Her limbs began to clamp down so tight that it was even getting difficult to breathe. Her breathing increased to the point of hyperventilation. She got to the point where she began to bite my shoulder at the base of the neck out of sheer fear. I could feel the blood begin to drip down my back and chest as I continued to comfort her. "I've got you. Okay, I've got you," I said in the best tone I could muster, considering the pain in my neck she was being. "They will not touch you." I got her ear right next to my mouth and whispered, "I will protect my house and those who are part of my house." This seemed to calm her a bit as she loosened up just a little. Taking my first deep breath since I picked her up, I turned to the window and yelled, "Those with malice in their hearts are not welcome in this house." This seemed to amuse them, as I could hear the faint sound of laughing. Again I yelled at the window, "I said piss off!" And all the laughing suddenly stopped. The air was dead silent for a few minutes at least, which seemed like over 10 minutes at the time. Then I could hear something just outside the window. It was almost like someone was talking at a whisper, just low enough that I couldn't understand what was being said, though I could see the window get a small, very minute crack in it. The sound of metal on glass echoed through the empty house as a streak began to appear across the glass. I couldn't see what it was, but something was being dragged across the glass, cutting into the glass window itself as it went from high on the right to low on the left. Slowly, it made a slice across the glass, making sounds similar to metal scraping against metal. When the line was done, there was a few moments of silence. Then another slow and methodical cut was started on the opposite side. My heart suddenly jumped as I knew what they were doing. Once they made the X across the glass, even a light breeze would break it, allowing them entry. All I could do was hold her and think, what can I do? That is when I tried something I knew would fail. Holding out my hand to the window, I yelled out, "For the love of God, stop!" And the line stopped moving. "Speak the name of the one you have come for." There was a moment of silence before what sounded like dozens of voices sounding off in unison. The name rumbled through the house, and instantly my guardian relaxed. I recognized the name, and it sure wasn't hers. I suddenly burst out laughing, but was able to bring myself back after a few seconds. "You dumbasses!" I yelled at the still empty window. "Does she look like him?" I yelled as she turned her head towards the window. If it wasn't for a mouthful of blood, she would have just looked like any other scared woman. There was another silence filling the air that seemed to last until my guardian yelled, "What do you want with my brother?" I couldn't hear anything as I felt her shake her head, and she asked, "What did he do?" Confused, I kept looking back and forth from the window to her. She must have gotten a response as she looked a bit shocked and disappointed at the window. A few moments later, she squeezed me tight as sound of a gale force wind hit the house, shattering the window and blowing glass across the room. I covered us with my arm and then turned to the window. My guardian looked at the window and began to let go. "They're gone," she said before taking a few calming breaths. I turned and said, "Good. Can you let me breathe now?" She realized how tightly she was holding me and then let me go. I stood up and put my hand on my shoulder. Pulling my hand back, I could see I was still bleeding, pretty good in fact. In fact, half of my shirt was still red and wet with fresh blood. My guardian apologized profusely for hurting me, but I just told her it's okay. I went to the bathroom and pulled out the first aid kit, and I was so happy that I just purchased this thing no more than 2 weeks ago. Seeing that it was simple puncture wounds, I figured I wouldn't need stitches, but cleaning these wounds was going to be a whole bunch of not fun. Pouring half a bottle of alcohol on the holes, I had to do my best not to scream like a little girl. The large bandages were coated in antibiotic cream before I put them on. Thankfully, I had someone to tape up the back. Yeah. Once that was done, I used a washcloth and hot water to clean the rest of me. That is when she began to apologize even more. She was so scared that when she clamped down on me, especially with that tail, she had left the rest of my torso covered with black, brown, and purple bruises. If you look close, you can even tell where her tail had clamped around my torso, leaving the most noticeable of impressions. I didn't say it to her, but I was really starting to hate that tail. Once cleaned up, I headed to the garage. I always kept some scrap wood around, and that window would need to be covered. This was not a fun job in the middle of the night with the jacked up torso, though as I worked, I had to ask about the conversation. "So, you want to tell me what you and that whatever in the hell it was were talking about?" I asked her. She looked away for a few moments before answering. It was my brother." Her silence compelled me to pry just a little bit more. "Yeah, I got that part. What did he do?" She took a breath and answered with, he fucked up." I turned and said, "I figured that. What did he do?" She raised her voice and said, "I told you, he fucked up," as she pointed up. It took me a second to get what she was saying. I had to pry for details, and it turns out he tried to convince a group of angels to take out the boss. The boss down below, that is, not the one up high. Because of the assault on the throne of hell, and the fact that less than half of the angels returned, has caused all sorts of havoc on both sides. Due to this, the more demonic and angelic creatures of this world have gotten much more active. If this keeps going the way, the physical world could become a battlefield itself. If this happens, the resulting natural disasters could wipe out 97% of the world's current population. The last time this happened, the only thing people remembered was the flood. Well, that explains the unexpected visit from her father. And here, I thought the worst problem we had was politicians. If it wasn't for the loss of blood, it would have been very difficult for me to sleep that night. With the window boarded up and the bandages still holding, I just had to go to bed and get some sleep. Someone else followed me the whole way there. When I asked, "What are you doing?" she simply said, I don't want to be alone tonight." I took a deep breath before motioning her inside. As she jumped onto the bed, I told her with a firm tone, "No funny business." I have to admit, it was nice to wake up with a young lady wrapped up on my arm. It was not nice, however, to have to unwrap her claws and tail off my body. I tried to get her off me while not waking her up, but she kept reaching out. So eventually I just kind of shook her awake. Though I quickly found myself wishing that my leg was awake. Her tail had cut off circulation at night, which means I need to spend a few minutes in severe pain while the blood goes back into my muscles. After tending to the animals, I came back to her making me breakfast. This surprised the crap out of me since I had no idea she even knew how to cook. As we finished up, I poured us another cup of coffee and asked her, "So, are you going to explain why I need a new window and maybe some stitches?" She looked almost pale as she explained how that the rules there are rules that they must follow. This includes not using their given abilities against the other side without permission. Also, demons and angels are to not get involved with each other unless God approves it. This made me ask for a little bit more information. As it turns out, if a demon gets too enamored by an angel, they might try to take advantage of said angel. This is a high crime even on the other side of the veil. In her brother's case, he was supposedly caught taking advantage of one. This news disgusted me to no end. Without hesitation, I told her, if he arrives at my door, he will not be welcome until I find out the truth. She turned to me, looking as though she was not going to argue with me about the decision. Then her face calmed down and she just nodded. We couldn't enjoy our coffee after that, though I could finally see something interesting. When she got upset, it was the only time she put sugar in her coffee, and I mean a lot of sugar. Now, I just use a tablespoon of honey myself, so it was very noticeable when she put 5 heaping tablespoons into her drink. The next couple of days were pretty uneventful. I repaired the house and was able to get her room cleaned up, though it seemed like I could feel things moving around me as I worked outside. It was almost like having a bird flying close by, close enough to notice, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Also, the neighbors' dogs were being uncharacteristically quiet. The one I could see had a large kennel, but when you opened the door to let them out, the dogs just froze. It was like they were protecting themselves by staying within the chain link fence. Even the cats, that had their own area so they wouldn't sleep in the barn, seemed only willing to come out for food and water. After seeing this, I noticed how quiet the forest was, and now I am truly on high alert. Early in the evening, I made a fire in the pit and was hoping to just relax and have a drink by it. My guardian came out, wrapped up in a blanket, and curled up in my lap again. I never do get used to how light she actually is. I mean, seriously. She took the cup and took a sip or two. She seemed to flinch a little as she put it back in my hand. I had to chuckle since I like my whiskey kind of strong but smooth. It may have been smooth going down, but it still had some serious bite to it. I simply took a drink and put the cup beside me. Then I wrapped my arms around her. We both watched the fire in silence as the wood popped and cracked. There was something relaxing about watching the sparks fly at night. She curled up even tighter into my chest, so much so that I was wondering if she could move enough to put another log on the fire. As it turns out, she just held on tighter as I moved. Letting the 2 logs hit the embers, I moved them into place with a stick and sat back down. Reaching for my drink, I took another sip and had just placed the cup back down when I heard, "Well, isn't this an interesting sight?" I shot up and my guardian was holding on to me, still wrapped up in the blanket, but nearly hanging off of my neck. Looking around frantically, I reached into my belt to grab my pistol. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," the man's voice said as I heard the sound of a safety clicking off. Slowly looking around, I noticed her head was locked in a certain direction. I looked and a form walked out of the darkness. It was a man for sure. He was dressed in clothes that hid him perfectly from the backdrop of the night as he slowly walked forward. In his hand, he held a semi-automatic rifle, which was also camouflaged with his finger on the trigger. I could see that this was a professional by the way he walked. His slow walk was not to intimidate, but instead to assure he could keep his eyes on me while walking on unfamiliar terrain. "I wasn't expecting this when I took this job," he said as he continued the advance. Seems like I could get double pay for this one. By now, he is standing almost directly across from us with a fire between us. One demon's head and one traitor's head in one go. Could be a really good payday. She began to hold me tighter as I wrapped my arms around her in an attempt to comfort her. The man did something unexpected after that. He sat down. Then he motioned for me to do the same. My guardian was now shaking in my arms as I sat back down. I couldn't see what was going on due to the blanket, but she began to wrap her tail around my torso. I moved my hand to her head and pulled her close before her tail began to tighten down. I had just healed from the last time she did that and didn't need to go through it again. The man spoke again. I see the two of you are close, and normally I would have just taken you both out and called it a day, but I have an issue. Which is? I asked him. My issue is that really want to get better pay for this job. I was confused and must have looked that way as my guardian's hands wrapped tighter around me. You see, the head of a succubus is one thing, the body is another, but bringing them one alive, well. He seemed to grin as he looked down at the fire. If you surrender her to me, he continued, then I won't have to hurt you. He seemed to let that simmer for a moment. Right now, there are a lot of contracts out, much more than usual, and I don't want to be involved with whatever in the hell's happening on the other side. That being said, a man has to make a living. By killing the innocent? I snapped at him. He laughed and said, Innocent? Do you know how many people her kind have taken out over the years? He narrowed his gaze and looked at her. Yes, I know all about you, succubus. I have hunted all of your kind, from the foxy ladies in the east to the ghouls in the Middle East. Each one of you hungry for the next life you're going to take. He stands up. She will keep you for a while, at least until she's gotten what she wants, and then you'll be nothing more than a husk of yourself. Every one of those she and her kind seduce end up in either hollow shells or simply her next meal. He took a breath to calm herself. He looked back at me and asked, Knowing that, are you still going to protect this thing? Or are you going to release her to me and I'll be on my way without another word? I paused for a moment and reached for the cup next to my chair. I picked it up and took a sip before answering, Let me think. I threw the cup of liquid that suddenly burst into flame, forcing him to cover his eyes. Then the blanket flinched as a shot came out. My guardian, while the man was talking, had unholstered my pistol and taken the shot. It hit the man and forced him to spin around and fall. My guardian screamed in pain as she recoiled, grasping her hand as she jumped up. I could see that the man was already starting to get to his feet, and with her injured, I simply grabbed her and bolted into the house. Just as we got through the door, bullets started hitting the side of the house. Not forgetting my training, I dove to the floor as the bullets pierced the walls. The lights were off in the house, so he couldn't see us anymore. Getting up, I got a glimpse of him holding onto his side. A small amount of blood came out from the side of his ribs, just a little low to hit his lungs. It was only a grazing shot, but at least he was hit. I ran for the Thompson, but before I could turn back, the man was out of sight. As I looked outside, I could hear him yelling and cursing beyond my sight. I moved to each of the windows in a frantic gambit to see him. I had a rough idea on where he was, as I could hear him yelling from his attempts to fix himself. The location of the hit would make it difficult at best to treat. I heard him yell, I'll have that succubus! I have already placed charms around this place. She can't leave without my say-so. That is when I first looked at her and her injury. I cursed as I did my best to wrap her up. Turns out when she fired my pistol, the slide had jammed itself directly into her hand. We had to stop the bleeding, so I wrapped her hand up with a towel before I pulled out a medical kit. Her hand was just a complete and total mess. This would take me a minute to clean, and even longer since she couldn't hold still as every touch was just excruciating for her. For a moment, I thought about knocking her out, but a knee on her wrist would simply work just fine to hold her in place. Outside, I could hear the man laughing. "She hurt herself, didn't she?" "I've got her blood now. There's no way she can hide now." Even more maniacal laughing. "Now that I have her blood, it won't be long before I can pull her out here myself." I looked into her eyes, and panic was overriding her pain. He continued, "Now, since I don't want to spend hours doing this, I'll give you another chance. Send her out, and I won't kill you. If you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows who harbors demons. I won't be long before you get a visit from another who is far less cordial than I am." He let that first part linger for effect, although I could hear the pain in his voice from treating the bullet wound. I was just about finished fixing her hand when I asked her, "Will this heal?" "Not with those charms out there." She seemed to flinch. "I can't even change." I could see her wings trying to push out, but they seemed to push like they were being flexed muscles under the skin, but just wouldn't come out. She once again looked at me with fear as the man called out, "Did you hear me, boy? I'd better get an answer before I have to do more damage to your house." "You better answer me." The sounds of the men screaming suddenly ripped through the night air. Shots rang out as sounds of flesh ripping came from the outside. It sounded like a pack of dogs had been let loose on him. That's when it hit me. Not dogs. Wolves. Running to the door, I turned on the outside lights. This illuminated the outside, but also would show my silhouette to the outside as well. I looked, at least as well as I could. There were 3 large werewolves that just were tearing the man to pieces. He didn't go down easy as one of the werewolves was on the ground, clearly shot. As they finished ripping the man's head off, my guardian called to me, and I turned around just in time to see her transform into her succubus form. This time she had more of a scaly look to her, along with her talons being much larger. She spread her wings and looked to the outside. I opened the door and went out first. I drew a bead on the closest werewolf, and a taloned hand laid on top of the sights and pushed slowly down, making the weapon lower. She looked almost as shocked as I was at the sight, but was not frightened. She walked over to the blanket that had her blood on it and threw it into the fire. Oddly enough, when it caught, it burned blue. Then she walked quickly over to the first wolf that was hurt. She rolled him over and asked, "Can we do anything?" I hesitated for a moment before getting in for an assessment. The werewolf was becoming slowly human again, and I could get a good look at his injuries. The bullet had gone through the chest on the left side. The angle suggests that he had been charging, and the amount of damage that does on the way through is brutal. She asked again if we could do anything, and I took a deep breath as large, clawed hands laid on her shoulders. We both looked up at the wolf's eyes, said it all. Before I even turned back, the wolf that had been hit stopped breathing. I stood up as the others gathered around it. Then they began to pick up the body and carry it into the forest. My succubus grabbed onto my arm as she watched. I yelled out, "Thank you! And I'm sorry. My condolences." The clear alpha turned and muttered something in a language I really don't understand. This clearly upset my guardian, but she didn't say anything. We started walking back to the house where I could double check her bandage. At least I thought so. As it turns out, when the man was attacked, the wolves had done something to whatever charms he was holding. I don't know if they broke them, threw them away, ate them for all I know, but they no longer had any control over my guardian. So, being that as it was, a few moments later she disappeared from my side and reappeared at the threshold of the house. I had forgotten that she could do that. When I got inside, I checked her hand, and due to her transformation, she had nearly completely healed. Oh, that made things easier for me. And as I put everything away, I asked, "So, what did they say to you?" She hesitated for a moment before answering. She said, "This is only the beginning." It had been weeks without a single issue. Good thing, too, at least I could fix the house. After dealing with that hunter, we didn't have much interest in hanging out by the fire anymore. This sucks, since that's what I built the damn thing for. My guardian had helped out where she could, but she keeps having to leave and then return. Most of the time, I simply ask, "How did things go?" And I get a simple "fine" or "it went all right." Though a few times she came in flustered or even scared, and that was when I would dig deeper. Some of the things she said didn't make sense to me, mainly because I had no point of reference, though what I could put together made ice water run up my spine. There was something happening on the other side of the veil, and the results were beginning to spill over to our side. Since emotional energy passes freely between all living things, it only stands to reason that a massive buildup on one side would affect the other. I tried not to think about it, but I could see the ripples happening around the planet. People coming at others with sheer vitriol for seemingly no reason, on grabbing onto the most ridiculous ideas and trying to fight others over it is crazy. As things got worse on our side, I tried to be ready. I've been building up a small stockpile of food and supplies that should last for years, but that was due to my location. If a natural disaster hits this area, the rescue folks won't be able to get here for at least a week. Now, with everything going on, it is time to kick things into high gear. With my pantries getting full and my freezer freshly filled, I should be able to weather the coming storm. There is one more area I must take care of, though: the security of me and my own. Though it is easy to find protection from most human weapons, it is another deal entirely to protect yourself from the weapons brought to our side from the other side. So I had to have a few things built. The sword was the most expensive piece, as it needed several parts made from specific materials. I thought the white oak was going to be hard to find, at least until I went out back. The far end of my property is covered in the stuff. The silver, on the other hand, was rather expensive, along with mixing titanium to make it a little lighter and a little stronger. The new alloy actually gives off a weird shine to it. The easiest pieces to make were the shields, a few small light ones, and one big one for me. Though I'm more of a dual sword type fighter, at least that's the way I've been trained, it's hard to beat a good solid shield. I mean, just ask the Spartans and Persians. All these items took me weeks to make, or have commissioned, but in the end, it was worth having, even if it was just for my own peace of mind. Then deer hunting season is when I first saw the migration and knew that I must absolutely be ready. Sitting in my tree stand can be rather boring. You can't move much or the animals will see you. You can't make any sounds or they'll scare all the prey away. You can't even shower much or the animals will smell it. Not only you, but the soap. So there I was, just in camouflage lump of holding a rifle. Now, I know a mind might wander while you're there, or you can even fall asleep, but what happened was definitely no dream. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I try to keep still as my heart rate goes through the roof. Ever so slowly, I turn my head and get a good look. Since I don't have a doe tag, I had to make sure of what I was taking. My heart increased again as I saw the rack on that deer. I didn't count it, but it had to be at least 20 points if it was one. Waiting until I had its head behind a tree, I raised my rifle and got in position, but had to freeze as it started moving again. Since it was the first day of the season, at least for landowners, It shouldn't have been surprising that it was walking like it didn't have a single care in the world. As it got behind a bush, I was able to get myself in perfect firing position. Using the stand as a base, I was perfectly stable. Now all I had to do was wait until it walked in the open. If you're wondering why I didn't just shoot through the bush, only amateurs will fire when you don't have a clear shot. That was a quick way to either just wound the animal and watch it run, making it basically a wasted hunt if you can't find it, or blow open the gut cavity and spoil the meat. This would also render the hunt pretty pointless. When it stepped out, something seemed off. My scope allowed me to see it as though I was only 10 feet away. Something about the way it moved just didn't seem right. Thinking that I should go for a shot to the brainstem, I moved the crosshairs slowly up towards the head. That is when it looked at me. That is no deer, I thought to myself. The face of the deer was nearly human, with large eyes that seemed to look into my soul at the 120 meters I was. The thing stopped and looked at me with inquisitive eyes as it seemed to wait for me to decide what to do. The hammer was already pulled back, and all I had to do was touch the trigger to put a bullet right between its eyes. But there was something wrong. The slightly green hue that it gave off made me more curious than anything else. Moving the scope down to look at the body, I could see more human-ish attributes along the muscular frame of the deer. There was no additional appendages to it, but one other odd thing that did stand out. The tail. The tail didn't move at all. Normally, a white-tailed deer would be flicking its tail as it walked along, but this one was completely still. The fear began to creep into my body as I moved the scope back up towards its head. This is also when I realized that the forest was completely still. I don't just mean animals had stopped moving or making noise, but the air seemed to be perfectly still as well. Once I moved back to its face, I opened my other eye so I could see it without the optic. From this distance, I couldn't really see a green glow, the human face, or anything else that made it different. I swapped back to my optic and the thing was still staring at me. But now, it seemed to smile. Not a cocky or brazen smile, mind you, but the same type of smile you would give seeing an old friend again. Now I was starting to be concerned. Remembering what I have heard from others about this type of creature, I suddenly knew exactly what to do. Moving my thumb up to the hammer, I placed my thumb on top of it, and I placed my finger slowly against the trigger and very softly squeezed. The hammer released against my thumb, and I slowly moved it back up so that it wouldn't strike the primer with enough force to fire. Keeping my eye locked on the deer, it seemed to know what I just did. It seemed to nod slightly before continuing to walk across my property. It moved with a deliberate grace as it moved down the hill and out of my sight. Sitting in that tree stand, all I could do was think and shake in fear. From what I know of these creatures, they just want to be left alone. Never go up and pet it, or you might just disappear if you're lucky. If not, you die in a very gruesome fashion. If you attack one, say by shooting it, they will come after you and kill you with an unseen force. Like most animals, they will just leave if you let them be. Though the fear did not leave me for another half an hour at least. As I finally calmed down, I got ready to leave the stand. That is when I saw more movement. This time, it was coming from the opposite direction. Once again, I froze in place and tried not to scare anything away. To my shock, a massive buck was slowly coming my way. Though large, it wasn't moving right. As it approached, I could see that it was injured. One of the rear legs had been damaged, most likely hit by a vehicle, so it wasn't able to move very fast. As I was able to get my rifle in position, I could see that it was in some major pain as it walked. It stopped in a perfect broadside position a mere 50 meters away. It looked away, giving me a shot to the back of its head, and I fired. Every hunter will tell you that the perfect shot never truly happens, but it did for me. When I got down and began to process the buck, I could see that it was in worse shape than I thought. There was a clear line where someone's brush guard had hit with some of the little spots of chrome still in its fur. I softly said, "Fucking poachers. I hope they ruined his suspension." The back leg had been broken in a way that had punctured the artery. I doubted I could have got much meat from the hindquarter, but I also knew that this buck wasn't going to be living for much longer, as it slowly was bleeding out from the inside, and that he had to be a lot of pain as well. Once I processed it out, I had the heart, liver, and kidneys in one bag and the intestines in another. I tried to skid so that I could get out and get ready for the 300 meters away to get my ATV. Thankfully, though, it was down the hill, which made it just a little bit easier. For the briefest of moments, I thought I saw a slight green glow from the other side of the hill, and I softly whispered, "Thank you," as I began the long walk, almost forgetting to bury the gut pile before leaving. That night, my guardian showed up, and I made her favorite venison roast. She was a little worried when I came in, but when I asked her what was wrong, she answered, "Nothing. Nothing you need to worry about." This made me want to finish the processing the deer as soon as possible. And we ate well that night, though I wondered if she was going to eat the plate too with the amount of food she put down. I keep forgetting that demons like her must either consume food or accept energy in other ways. I know that she has not been summoned for a while, so her hunger is very justified. After dinner, I told her about the deer I saw, and she shot up from her position asking me questions about it. Things like, "What did it look like?" and "Did it do anything weird?" and even, "Did you try to touch it?" or "Did it touch you?" All of which seemed to come at me in rapid succession, almost like an auctioneer. So much so that I had to slow her down to even answer one of them. When I told her everything, she curled up in a ball and began to shake. She began to explain that those creatures are some of the only ones that can freely pass between the other side and here. They are extremely strong and are feared by all those who travel to our side. It was finally able to get her to answer why, and she answered, "You know that we lose a bit of power when we come to this side. Well, we also are susceptible to damage when we do so. Like when you were able to capture me the first time, I wasn't able to get away since I had fully transferred over. Meaning I could have, or you could have stabbed me with a knife or carry, and it would have done the job just as well as any holy weapon." She took a deep breath before continuing. "Those things don't lose any power, or if anything, they gain power coming to this side. This makes them incredibly dangerous if you even appear to be a threat." I thought to myself, why would petting it be a threat? But I didn't have time to worry about that as my guardian began a full-blown panic attack. No matter how much I assured her that it walked away, she was just shaking and just kept shaking. She was freaking out so much that she couldn't stay in human form, and even wrapped herself up in her tail and her wings. For a demon like her, this looks so pathetically cute. I wrapped her in a blanket, made her some hot chocolate, and sat with her as she streamed a comedy movie on TV. She only chuckled a little as she very, very slowly calmed down. That night, she didn't want to sleep alone, so I put her in the bed with me. She was still a little put off by the fact of when I told her that she had to wear pajamas and she was not to take me while I slept. She tried to argue a little bit and claimed that the intimate contact, and I quote, "it will calm us down," where I responded, "Unlike you, I am calm." While I stayed stone-faced, she got a little mad at this. I know that anger is better than fear, so I went to sleep with her next to me and woke up with her laying across my abdomen. Looking out to the daylight, I started to look over to the horizon. I could barely make out a slight green glow through the leafless trees. I smiled a bit and gave a small nod. Then I looked at the succubus sleeping on me and worried that if I woke her, she would freak out again, so I simply let her sleep. The glow left with the morning sun, and I slipped out of bed. I've got a lot of work today, and it's time to get started. Well, it's been a very interesting winter so far. Once the weather got cold, I really didn't expect too much movement around this area, especially after the deer came through a few months back. I had to stop mentioning it around my guardian because she would just start shaking uncontrollably. Truth be told, I only bring it up when she starts to get a little too close and a little handsy, and I need to calm her down a bit. I would say something like, "Is that a green light out there?" as I'm looking out the window, or would talk about hunting. It doesn't matter if I was talking about snaring rabbits or something, she would still get worried. As a joke, I asked her if she would do the No Nut November challenge, which she started at the beginning of hunting season, and she seemed to get real mad at me. She yelled, "Of course I do that, though I never get past the third week." Confused, I asked her why, and the answer was obvious that I kicked myself a little bit for not realizing. You see, those that participate tend to let their imaginations run wild a bit. This will usually kick in during the second week, but the third week, most men are highly sexualized cultures, will hit their limit and have a naughty dream. For a succubus, this is a type of harvest time. She and others like her will sneak into a room around that time the dream begins to get erotic. At that point, they will begin to make their move. In fact, this is exactly what she was trying to do with my nephew the first time we met. If I hadn't woken up and stopped her, she would have taken the energy she wanted, and my nephew would have had been out of sorts, I guess you'd say, for a few days. Not from the energy drain. That's normal for a man after, intercourse. But the euphoria succubus leaves the man with. In such cases, it is possible to turn a good man into a sex addict, even if they're a virgin. When the third week came to pass, no pun intended, I didn't see much of her except when she showed up for the mornings and slept it off. Thinking of it like drinking. If you have a beer once a week or a month, your tolerance will be low, so low that you will feel the effects in a single can. Now, with that in mind, think of the same tolerance as you go for a week-long bender. We have all had to sleep off a long night before. Those succubi are lucky in the fact that they do not have to get the actual hangover, though they still have to sleep part of it off. Considering all this, it's a good thing she doesn't make true physical contact, at least how we understand it, of course. If she did, then she would be constantly pregnant and a petri dish of virus and bacteria. When I asked her about it, she said, "Every time I do this," and she teleported across the room, "all that stuff goes away and I'm as fresh as the day I was born." I was about to ask why she hesitated there, but I figured I would leave it. Over the winter, the weather had been rather weird. Though most people didn't know the half of it, there had been a lot more movements, too, from the other side. And since they must be using certain points to move freely, I've been able to see things that made my heart drop into my ass. In one such case, there was a winter storm that turned into a blizzard that came right across my area. Don't get me wrong, it's still cold now, but the weather has been weird. During the storm, I went out to get more firewood for the stove. With all this, we must save money nowadays, especially with inflation. While I was getting the wood, the wind and snow kicked up exceptionally hard, so much so that I was almost knocked off my feet a couple of times. On my way to get the final load of wood, the snow got so thick that I found myself thanking God for skiing goggles, or I would have been totally screwed. The wind kicked up so hard that I had to take a knee to keep from falling over at one point. When I finally got to the wood pile, the snow was so thick I couldn't even see the house, and it was less than 50 feet away, so I started to calculate the direction to get back. While I was doing that, I began to see things move in the snow. Something or some things that was not natural. Slowly looking around, I could see something moving through the air like a sheer silk sheet. Sheets wither with the snow moved all around me, making me turn left and right, trying to focus on whatever was moving around. I kept my hand on the wood pile as though it was an anchor. 2 steps away from it, and I would have been lost for sure. Not knowing what I was looking at, my mind wondered if there was a pack of predators around. This made me reach under my coat and drew my pistol. Placing my back against the woodpile, I continued to frantically look around in a vain attempt to see what was out there. You can call me paranoid, but I've seen and been through enough shit to realize you don't take this threat of danger for granted. As I got down on one knee, I positioned myself so that if a predator came, it would have to come at me from the front. That's when I heard it. The laughter. Slight laughing and chuckling coming from the storm. It was low at first. So low, I wasn't sure what I was hearing. Eventually, it got loud enough that I realized that it was a woman's voice coming from the endless curtain of white surrounding me. Confused at first, I listened closer, opening my mouth a little to allow my hearing to work just a little better. Then I lowered my pistol and yelled to the storm, "Come out now!" The laughter continued, and I could see movement much clearer. Tinted lenses definitely helped with this. I yelled again, "I said come out, where I can see you!" The wind picked up, and I could feel something brush against my arms and my head. I could almost feel it caressing my cheek as I stood there. "If you don't want to come out, I can make it hurt!" I yelled again into the solid white, which had gotten so thick I could barely see the black pistol in my hands. Another brush passed, this time getting under my winter clothing, causing a streak of cold to go through my body from my head to my feet. "Fine," I said as I started to pray. This time I used the Latin prayers that I had been studying. At first it laughed louder, but as I continued, it got a bit violent. It used the wind to force itself into me, knocking me back against the wood pile, but not stopping me from continuing my prayer. When I finished, I stated it again, but this time I yelled with all I had in my lungs into the ice-cold air entering my lungs with each breath. Reaching the end of the prayer, I could taste the blood in my throat as the frozen air had begun to tear at my vocal cords. When I finished the second prayer, I took a deep breath, feeling the cold begin to rupture my voice box. But I began again. This time, I didn't even get the first sentence out. The snow, the wind, it all just stopped. The world held perfectly still around me for a few moments before the snow began to all pull in one direction. I spun around to look at it, and it was pulling together at the top of the stacked woodpile. I held my pistol tight as I had no idea what was going to come out of it. To my surprise, a figure formed, but it wasn't a disgusting monster. This was the shape of a beautiful Asian woman in a solid white kimono. Her skin was nearly as white as her clothes, and her long, flowing white silver hair flowed down close to her waist. She stood there for a moment, as the last of the snow combined to make her gracious appearance. It was then that she opened her eyes, those almond-shaped black eyes that seemed to shine in the daylight. All of this while the storm seemed to go around us, leaving us in a void of the snow with no snow. It was surprising. The snow was around us. The wind had shaped as though we were in the eye of a storm. I will admit that a shout of fear went down my spine as she looked down at me with those eyes. However, I didn't move. I simply asked, "Yokai?" To which she smiled and nodded slightly. Now, my Japanese language skills are so out of practice that I wouldn't even try anything beyond a single word. So I asked if she spoke English. She looked annoyed a bit and nodded again. So I asked, "Okay, cool. So you could come down here so we could talk, please?" She looked annoyed at first until I followed up again with, "Please?" The wind seemed to pick up as part of her body turned to snow. Then she seemed to float down next to me. Once she reformed herself, I asked her what she was doing on my land. "So you're not native to this area. How did you end up here?" I asked her. She spoke in a very thick accent about how forces are gathering and how she had been summoned. I thought back to that pack of werewolves and simply nodded my head, though I still didn't get a reason why she was on the wrong side of the Pacific Ocean. That is when I asked why she was bothering me. Then she responded, "I just wanted to play with you, feel your warmth." I told her, "You should have just knocked on my door. I have a fire going." She looked at me with the look of a mother has when a child asks her questions to something should already know the answer to. I just tilted my head and told her that she was lucky I didn't start shooting and hit her. She looked at my pistol like a person driving a tank would look at a pellet gun. She couldn't tell, but I grinned a bit as I ejected the magazine and showed the bullets to her. "These are not your normal bullets, young lady," I said before she reached out and touched one with her finger. She pulled back like she had just been burned on her finger and looked at me with a bit of anger and fear. I calmed her down when I put the magazine back into the pistol and put the pistol back in the holster. When I looked back at her, she looked a bit confused that I had put my weapon away. When she asked me why I did not fear her, I told her I have dealt with creatures like her before. When I mentioned my guardian's name, she seemed to recognize it, and even seemed to be thinking of something else, almost playfully. I had to guess my guardian has been talking about me, or maybe they have a more personal experience. It was not long before something seemed to get her attention, which was in the same direction the wolves were going before. She apologized for needing to leave and seemed to take a very traditional Japanese decorum as she stood there with both hands in front of her and bowed. She looked a little confused that I didn't bow back. Instead, I reached out my hand. Slightly hesitant, she did the same, and I turned her hand and kissed her wrist. I figured I would feel cold even though that neoprene mask I was wearing, but there was no change at all. She almost seemed to blush at this. Before she left, I got her name, and she left me with a warning. There are others like me. Not all are pleasant to deal with. In truth, they would rather kill you and take your heat than play with you. I think one may be close behind me. I joked and said, "And what a nice behind it is," as I tilted my head, which seemed to make her blush again. And then she turned away. Her body broke apart into snow, and the void that we were in seemed to break as the weather hit me so hard I fell on my ass. Picking myself up, I remembered why I was out there in the first place. I got as much wood as I could carry and headed back to the house. On the way back, the snow once again got really thick. There was so much coming in so quick that I almost lost my bearings. As I reached the back deck, I could see I only had a few more feet to go before I got to the door, and that's when I heard it. The sounds of laughing, maniacal laughing, in the air was nearly transparent cloth moved in front of me. A bit annoyed, I called out, "Why did you come back?" When this phrase hit the wind, it picked up again, and I was having trouble attempting to walk. That is when something hit me. It hit me with enough force to knock me down, spilling the wood from my hands. Trying to shake off the hit, I reached out, moving my arms around, and found the bottom of the 4x8 post that held up the deck. Using it as a guide, since I couldn't see anything, I got to my feet. Leaning against the post, I looked out into the whiteout and noticed that my goggles were beginning to ice up. I only had about a minute before they would be totally covered, and I would be essentially blind. I tried in vain to wipe them off while beginning my prayer. The laughter turned into screaming that seemed to come from every direction at once. Thinking I was making it feel pain, I spoke up. I didn't see it coming, but the force of the hit would not let me miss that impact. Slamming into the post, I hit my back and my head and blurred my vision a little bit. I looked down and I could easily see a 5-foot long, 4-inch thick icicle that had skewered me and pinned me to the post. I would have screamed, but the hit to my head had torn my vocal cords and stopped me from uttering even a single sound. The void around me began to show, and a form began to build itself around me. Though a feminine form, this was no young lady. There was no clothing on this nearly white and hairless creature. Its arms seemed to hang far low for a humanoid of its size. Its hands were twisted into claws with more than 6 fingers each finger twisted into distorted talons, with more talons pointing the opposite way. The body was long and emaciated to the point that one could barely make out a feminine or masculine bone structure. Its skin hung off its body like someone who had lost over 700 pounds, leaving behind the emaciated form. Its legs were just as distorted as arms, with talons on the front and back side of its toes and heels. Even the knees seemed to have pointed bone coming from under the skin, aiming down. The body had no hair on it all, but the worst part was the head. The head was shaped into a strange mask-like structure. Not a deer like a Wendigo, but something much more demonic. 2 rows of shark teeth are shown across its lipless mouth, set up in a way that makes it look like it's smiling. A triangular, almost diamond-shaped head had sharp points coming out in random direction, and those eyes, those non-blinking black holes of eyes that seemed to look through me with the most hate and vitriol one can muster. This thing began to walk slowly to me, slightly stumbling on its distorted legs, as though it was trying to savor the moment. It got right up to me and slowly raised its misshapen arms. It pulled off my nearly frozen goggles and my hat with it. The cold air shot pain through my skull as it reached up and ripped off my frozen mask. With this, my head was fully exposed, and I looked at all the frozen spike through my torso, and then looked up to see its lifeless eyes looking at me. With what I could muster, I whispered out, "Why?" To this question, it paused and began to speak. I may not be able to speak Japanese worth a damn, but I can understand some of it. The bits I could understand were, "I'm going to kill you, hurry, more, demon, and fight." While it spoke, I was reaching into my belt. When I pulled out my pistol, it took a step back in motion for me not to shoot myself. I was confused, as it had already pierced me clean through. It then reached out with its hand and touched the side of my face and neck. Though I was cold before, but this was on another level. I could feel the heat being pulled out of my extremities and out via the touch it had on me. It seemed to give it a high of almost sheer pleasure. With that, my adrenaline kicked into overdrive as I raised the pistol, pushed the barrel against its chest, and fired 4 rounds into it. It immediately fell back screaming with a mixture of a wounded bear, a stuck pig, an injured child, and a dying sheep. It staggered back and fell over as the special bullets I had burned into its body like magma. I watched for a moment as it kicked and screamed in pain, although this is all I could do since half of me was too cold to move, which is why I only got 4 shots off. After less than a minute, I could begin to move again, especially since the storm had suddenly calmed down to normal levels. With some movement of my legs, I got them working enough that I could break myself free from the post I was attached to. I put my pistol in my left hand so that I would be firing into the forest instead of into the house, and shot the end of the icicle. From there, I walked over to the creature as it was now barely moving. It looked so pathetic, laying there, unable to move. Many of its harsher features had begun to withdraw into a slightly more appealing form. The mask that covered the face didn't move as it spoke, but many of the more distinguishing traits had retreated. Looking down at it, I had to wonder if this was what it looked like before. It looked at the pistol confused, but I understand now why. So many of these creatures that jump from one side of the veil to the other forget the simple fact: when you enter the physical realm, you are susceptible to physical dangers, like weapons. For a lot of them, you must be specific on the types of weapons or spice them up a bit. However, it still matters. As I looked at it, I could feel the blood seeping into my clothes, so I didn't have a lot of time. Kneeling next to it, I began to give it last rites. Now, I'm not a priest or rabbi or anything like that, so I don't know if it worked. I still seemed to give it a sense of calm, though. It reached up and grabbed my hand as though it was trying to comfort me as well. I didn't feel good about what happened next. Placing the pistol under its jaw, it looked at me and gave me a nod. The sound of the echo through the air as my body jerked. Everything seemed to go in slow motion as the slide came back, ejecting the hot brass into the air. Immediately, I slid the pistol down to the torso and put one through its heart. With this, the body fell apart like fresh powdered snow. I want to say I was strong enough to just get up. I want to say I felt nothing. I want to say that I didn't stay there. I want to say I didn't scream to the heavens for a minute. I want to say I didn't curse myself at sending another to the other side. I want to say I didn't look at my pistol and think, maybe I should. What I will say is that I eventually got up and got inside. The icicle was already half melted by the time I got inside, and it was a good thing I had gone full prepper after my first run-in with the cryptid. I had plenty of QuikClot on standby, along with all the other bandages I needed. However, I still called the paramedics. I had lost a lot of blood and couldn't drive, so no need to risk it. A day and a half later, I came home to a worried succubus in human form. Normally, I would give her hell for walking around the house bare-ass like she does, but I was just glad to be home. Plus, it was nice to have someone to come home to. It took me a week or so to be good enough to work outside, though skiing and snowboarding season is done early for me. But hey, maple syrup season is starting. I just have to wonder one thing as I get ready to tap the trees. Can I get through the season without any more weird things happening? Well, I guess I didn't get my wish. Seriously, can I get a week without some strange creatures walking across my property? I know they have to go to my neighbor's place on the other side of the swamp, but can they stop bugging me on the way by? First was that ice woman with black eyes, then another one with a really bad attitude that left scars on both sides of my torso, Now I gotta deal with a bunch of goblins trying to raid my sap buckets. It isn't like they're difficult to deal with. My guardian says their spiritual energy reserves are quite low, so they can't just disappear instantly like others can. Though they have an annoying habit of destroying things on the way through. At first, I thought it was the wind knocking a bunch of buckets over off the taps, but nope. These annoying little things decided to pull them off and drink all the sap they could find. To my surprise, sweet things are like liquor to these creatures. I actually have found 4 of them passed out next to the collection bin. When I asked my guardian what to do, she responded, "They drank all the maple syrup." Right before, she picked one up and disemboweled it. She began to change into her succubus form, tearing her clothes into shreds in the process, and going full rabid dog on them. Though I'm sure the first 4 next to the bin didn't feel a thing, I can't say that about the others. The sight of her monster form darting through the forest was kind of interesting to see at first, at least until she started jumping from tree to tree. What I couldn't see is what she could sense. If one was hiding in the tree using magic to camouflage itself, in her eyes, it was like painting the entire body in blaze orange. She would climb a tree with frightening speed and lunge at something. Then I could see the goblin come into view as it fell to the ground, usually gushing some fluids. At least, whatever parts were left of it, of course. In one case, she only swiped off a leg and it fell to the group holding its bloody stump. Another one was decapitated, and for the first few moments all I could see was its head fly through the air. Then its body slowly came into view as it tumbled to the ground. It was at this point they didn't even bother with the magic cover as they all appeared. This was when I got a good look at them, standing about 2.5, maybe 3 feet high, with that green, almost pale skin. Some wore clothing, while others wore almost nothing, but all they had were these strange eyes and twisted, pointed ears. They looked like something out of a comic or a horror cartoon, but sounded different. There was a mix of languages being spoken by each one. When I looked closely, I realized that each one spoke a single language. Not sure why, but that is what happened. As my guardian came close to the group of goblins, as they got into defensive position, one of them pulled out a talisman of some sort. He spoke something in a language I didn't understand, and my guardian was flung backwards. She had been running at them on all 4s, and whatever hit her made her tumble like she had been hit in the face, and just the face, by a dump truck. I had to watch as she flipped backwards in the air twice before even touching the ground, where she continued to tumble, ending up crumpled in a heap on the ground. Seeing this, my heart fell into my gut as she crashed, and I started running. Drawing my pistol, I fired a shot. From where I was standing, I couldn't get a good angle, so I just ran at them. I could see one holding a talisman began to chant and pointing at me. Like a wave of ocean water hitting me, I staggered back, grabbing at the trees next to me to keep from falling over, even digging the handle of my pistol into the bark of a sapling. Oddly enough, I suddenly felt like I had drank a case of energy drinks. That is when I turned towards that little shit and smiled. I wondered if he knew just how much trouble he was in. When he began to chant again, I put a .45 caliber slug between his eyes. Seeing this, the others began to use their ability to disappear, and I just kept shooting. I got 2 more and maybe wounded a few others, as I could hear them running away, screaming. After a quick reload, I emptied the next magazine into the area I thought they were running. Not very safe or smart, but I had to drive the point home. After looking over the goblins, I noticed the talisman and removed it from his body. I thought I could just pull it off, but the body was so light I ended up lifting the entire body off the ground. Grabbing the neck, I pulled the talisman off and dropped the body to the ground. Then I turned to more important matters. I ran over to my guardian and checked her over. She was out cold from whatever just hit her. Her body was covered in bruises and her face looked like she got stomped by a boot. I looked and she still had her teeth, thankfully, and better yet, she was still breathing. Where she was laying, she had hit her head on a couple of rocks, and I suddenly started to wonder where I left my skin stapler. Picking her limp body up, I began to carry her to the house where I could treat her injuries. It was visible to the road for a minute as I made my way to the house when a truck drove by. I just hoped no one saw her that way, with her wings dragging on the ground and her tail bouncing against my leg as I walk. Also, those torn clothes revealing her amazingly fit body would make any man want to look. Though the hard part was getting her through the back door without hitting her parts, i.e. her wings or tail, on the doorframe, or her horns for that matter. After putting her back together, I left her in the spare room and went back outside. It was going to be a long day of cleaning out buckets, collection bits, reattaching tubes, resetting taps. It was dark by the time I got in, and thankfully found someone up and about. My guardian was still in a bit of pain, but had made her dinner to thank me. Even though she can't cook very well, it was very well appreciated. I wasn't going to concern myself with the bodies outside. As far as I was concerned, the critters could eat well tonight. It's been a week since then, and there has been no sign of a goblin. My guardian says, once you scare them enough, they never come back. I told her, well, that's a relief. Then she added, yeah, if they were trolls, that would be a different story. She suddenly had my full attention. It's been a while. It's been a while since I had to deal with any type of beyond physical issues. And yet it's still cold outside. Perhaps not cold enough to justify an ambush from one of those snow women, but it's still cold today. With everything happening around the world, my attention has not been focused much on what my guardian must deal with. Since the two sides of the veil are connected, it shouldn't surprise me that there is conflict over there as well. I'm not sure how that side of the veil deals with their situations. All I know is that my guardian dreads every single trip she must take. So much so that she curls up against me every single night, even though I do have to force her to wear something. I don't sleep very good with a skinny succubus jumping awake at any sound louder than a mouse fart. More than once I've woken up not being able to feel my leg. When she gets really scared, she wraps her tail around me and just starts squeezing like a snake. Twice I've almost had to go to the hospital due to the pressure placed onto my muscles. Also, those damn claws. Her claws are not very long, but they are rather sharp. Her hands and feet end in claws that can retract. Think of it like a cat's claw. Although they're clearly human-shaped hands and feet, it is still odd that she can extend those claws out. When she has a bad dream, I don't sleep much that night. Yesterday, we had another uninvited guest show up at my door. This time, there was a knock at my door. A very strong and deliberate knock at my door. I didn't use much. When I looked to see who it might be knocking on the door, I couldn't see anyone. Still looking out the glass of the front door, I heard the knocking again, as well as seeing the door shake. Instantly, this made my blood run cold. Reaching for my pistol and knife, I asked, "Who is it?" There was a few moments of silence before the knocking started up again. This time, the strikes were hard enough that the wall began to shake a bit. I suddenly thanked my cousin for suggesting the door hardening kit. For with that on, whatever was beating on the door would have better luck breaking through the wall. As the knocking continued, my guardian ran out to the bathroom. She asked me, "What's going on?" as her naked frame shimmered from having run freshly out of the shower. As she realized the knocking at the door, she began to shake in fear a bit. She looked at the door and yelled, "Either announce yourself or fuck off." With that, the knocking stopped. I looked at my guardian, and she looked as confused as I was. Though before I could ask her what she thought, the door was broken clean off its hinges as though someone had used an explosive charge to open it. We were both flung back to the far wall, where we landed in a heap. Looking up, I could see a large entity entering the house. Through dazed eyes, I pulled up my pistol and fired into the doorway in an attempt to force it back. That is when something hit the ground outside the door. Laying on the ground was the creature of some sort. I was busy trying to get my feet, so I didn't get a good look at first. It was clearly some sort of demon, with wings that large, especially. I know from experience that the more powerful the demon, the bigger the wings. This one seemed to have another, but much smaller pair up higher in its back. That was when my guardian began to freak out. She rolled the creature over, exposing its naked form, and immediately stared to see if it was all right. To my shock and horror, I had just shot my guardian's older sister. She was lucky. Out of the 4 bullets I fired, only 2 hit her. One was a grazing shot in her leg, while the other hit her in the torso. With the succubus' ability to heal, I just had to get the bullet out of her and she would be fine. However, that was far easier said than done. Try performing surgery on someone while they're trying desperately to hold still and failing miserably. It took a right hook to her face before I could work, knocking her cold. She would have to wait in the guest room while her injuries healed. It was dangerous enough to have one succubus in the house, but one strong enough to blow off a door like that? I had planned on showering before making lunch, but that was out the window, or door. Taking a deep breath, I got all my tools and got ready to remount the door. I would need a new door frame, but getting it back in place would have to do for now. If someone asked, I would just tell them, "It was a wild night. Don't ask." That usually gets people to back off and not ask too many questions. Thankfully, my guardian said she would handle lunch, and I could finally clean up. Even as I headed towards the shower, I was wondering, with 2 succubi in the house, would I ever get a shower without interruption? Many times as I'm showering, my guardian would walk in because she forgot something. It got to the point where she insisted on a clear shower curtain. I humored her because it was the cheapest one available anyway. Now, as I'm just starting to finish up, I see a very tall, very curvaceous winged creature looking at me through the semi-clear plastic. I ask her, "What do you want?" Which, of course, I got no response. Although I did see, as she moved forward, push her ample breasts into the plastic. Looking away, I rinsed myself off and reached for the fixture to turn off the shower. "Are you going to just stand there?" I asked. All she did was push her body harder against the shower curtain, to the point she was beginning to step into the shower stall itself. Shaking my head, I turned on the shower hose, cranked up the cold water, yanked the curtain back to the side, and began to soak her down. She stumbled back to the ground where I sprayed her for a few more seconds, and as she looked up to me, I firmly told her to cool off. Before turning off the water, I grabbed my towel and headed towards the closet for some fresh clothes. As she began to get to her feet, I grabbed another towel from the linen closet and tossed it to her. It partially unfolded and landed on her head, right between her horns. I chuckled at the sight for a moment before leaving to get dressed. After getting dressed, we all sat down for lunch, and this is where I got the reason she was here, and it was worse than I thought. Due to the fighting on the other side, there was a good possibility of demons running short on energy within the next year. The main energy that fuels them has been disrupted and can't be cultivated, so they say, correctly. I began to see their issue. Because of this, the demons that have been leaving everyone alone will become desperate for energy. This means they will have to go back to the old ways. When I asked what they meant by the old ways, where I was treated to a very long story about how demons of different types would cross over to get their energies to sustain themselves. This could be in the form of physical energy, sexual energy, depression is an energy as well, though a few decide to go more direct route and feed on flesh and blood. A succubus or incubus can get what they need over a year from a single sexual encounter. Vampires, werewolves, and others like them get their energies from consuming flesh. Thankfully, they don't need much as people think. Case in point, A vampire only needs to feed once every few years, sometimes a decade, if they get a full meal. The kicker is that a full meal for them will result in someone becoming a vampire or just straight up dead. A very hungry one that doesn't know how to feed correctly will definitely kill their victim. I already knew how these creatures gained their energy from people, so that didn't make me worry. What puckered my asshole was the number they were talking about. The numbers were well into the millions. I asked them if there was any way to stop them, and which both of them chuckled at that idea. Though they did calm down, letting me know that many of the demons would either be taken out by angels or not be able to cross over due to lack of energy. Thinking about it, it all made sense. It does take a good amount of spiritual energy to pass back and forth, so many of the weaker ones would kind of just be stuck. That is, unless someone performs a summoning. This made me chuckle since humans have a remarkable ability to summon demons. Even subconsciously, that is, like when my nephew summoned our guardian in his sleep. Which led me to ask how the hell she was strong enough to break down my front door. As it turns out, this succubus was such a high-level demon that she must hide wherever she is summoned into the physical realm. If she stays too long, she will have angel teams right after her. Kind of like a video game, though. If the angels find her, they'll send her back, but she'll lose all the progress she has made. If that happens, anyone that holds a grudge against her will take revenge. And for a succubus, that means they will be taken forcefully, a lot, and repeatedly. Though this turned my gut into a pretzel, so I offered her to stay, provided that she follows the rules I set forth. With a seductive smile, she agreed, but it faded when I told her she was not to have any intercourse with anyone while they were in this house, unless they expressly confirmed their desire to her. From a succubus, this was like putting a heavy meat eater on a vegetarian diet, though she relaxed a little when her sister told her that she had to deal with the same rules. Also, there was no use of her powers in or around the house unless it was for self-preservation. This rule was easier for her to deal with, though when I told her she needs to look human as much as possible, she rolled her eyes as hard as she possibly could. Even though she was able to change in under a minute, I still had to say, "You need clothes too." As she was led into the other room by my guardian, I got a good look at her human form. I know a few guys would cold cock their own mothers just to have an hour or two with something that good looking. Even though she was almost my height, she was filled out in all the right places and thin in all the others. Having two of these succubus here is going to be tough, though not as difficult as what I see coming. Finally, it seems that all the fighting from the other side is calming down. Although all I keep hearing is how this the calm before the storm. Unfortunately, that is all I can understand most of what they say. This being due to them constantly changing languages when they speak. From the guardian and her sister, this is normal, but it's difficult for me to understand what in the hell they're saying. It isn't the fact that they're changing at random, but instead the words in common use, for them, can come from any language ever used. Apparently, this is why it's so difficult to correctly summon a demon. You have to use words that are in common use. You can't use slang or anything that can be misconstrued. And then you can simply use the root language if you got it down. However, you do have to be able to pronounce the words correctly. Thankfully, I have two in my house that can teach me. Since it is springtime, it is nice to have an extra set of hands to help me with a garden and other spring cleaning. At least it would if a certain hot toddy would ever get off her ass once in a while. Though as soon as I can get her outside, the neighbor kids show up in even bigger and bigger groups. Now I'm used to folks walking down the street and slow down when my guardian is outside. Also, the boys for the next half a mile any direction will make it a point to be around just in time to see her in those sparse outfits she wears. Now, oh boy, I've got two stunning women washing my car and truck, wearing barely anything to cover the most important areas. You can also guess what happens when they get bored and start spraying each other with the hose. If the entire situation wasn't so funny, watching the local kids practically juice themselves at the sight, I would have put a stop to it. The weird weather has me wondering what's going on. Though it's warming up, these cold snaps have made it impossible to get crops in the ground. I've also lost another one of my beehives. When I went to check on the remaining hives, I felt something cold rub against my neck. I know that feeling. Looking around, I couldn't see a wisp of air, but I knew she was there. I looked into the woods for a green glow, but there wasn't anything there either, not that I could see. Opening my suit, I reached in for my pistol, and that's when I felt a hand on my arm. The hand was placed on my forearm as I reached into my beekeeper suit, but it wasn't trying to stop me. I looked down and could see a hand holding my arm, but not trying to freeze it. My eyes followed the arm up to the body of the yokai that was in the process of pulling itself together. The torso and head began to form together as though drifts of smoke were pulling themselves together. The body of the young woman began to form next to me, and I looked at her slender form reach to the ground, forming pelvis and legs. As the wisp condensed along enough to become solid, almost like skin, her face became very clear. Her eyes are still darker than the night without a moon, but there was something about the way she presented them. There wasn't any sadness that I could see emanating from her eyes, nor was there fear. What did come out was concern. I looked into those eyes as her long black hair began to flow down her back, and that perfect kimono formed around her body. Those eyes seemed to look into my soul as though they were concerned about my safety. With her newly formed second arm, she raised her hand and pointed into the distance. I turned and looked at what she was pointing at, and my blood ran cold for a totally different reason. Standing about 70 meters away, perfectly still, was a man-shaped form with an elk like a head. The body blended in so well with the surroundings that I was having trouble focusing on it. I didn't see any eyes, but it seemed to be looking right at me. And when the snow woman whispered something I did not understand in Japanese in my ear, I could barely speak her language, so I looked at her confused. That's when she began to show fear in her eyes. When I turned back to that thing, it wasn't there, not where I'd seen it before. It was gone. I pulled up my pistol and cocked the hammer back. As I looked around, not seeing anything, I looked for the snow woman. She was gone too, though I could still feel an unnatural chill in the air. Shaking off the experience, I continued to walk to the beehives, this time with my pistol up and ready. Though as I walked, I realized how pointless it would be to use a pistol. If I was right, that creature was a Wendigo. I had never seen one before, so I wasn't sure. Enough strange things have happened in the past few years that I'm just kind of losing track. The fact with the Wendigo is kinetic force doesn't do much at all to them, aside from making them very angry. The best I could hope for was the specialized bullets that might hurt this thing as they burned and make it go away. Normally, the only thing I can take out a Wendigo is fire. Never thought I would regret not smoking. Opening up the hives, I could see that the remaining broods were doing just fine. With the daffodils coming into full bloom, they should be able to kick the season off right. I had to place my pistol on top of one of the hives to open the others, though I did keep it within arm's reach, just as habit and training dictated to me. On my way to the second hive, I reached for my pistol so I could move it. It wasn't there. I looked over and the damn Wendigo was standing next to the hive, holding my pistol. It wasn't holding it correctly, but instead it held it like a child trying to figure out how something works. I stood there, frozen in fear, at this 8.5 foot tall creature examining my 45. Eventually, it must have gotten bored as it dropped the pistol to the ground and reached out for me. Still in shock, I stood there as its long, rotting arms reached out for me. When it reached for me, it sank its claws deep into my shoulders and began to growl. It bared several layers of teeth before opening its massive mouth full of broken and jagged teeth. That was when a blast of cold hit the side of my face so hard it was like somebody had slapped me. The Wendigo seemed to feel the same thing as it shook its head like a horse trying to shake off flies. I realized what was going on, and I knew I only had a moment to act. I grabbed the closest hive and used all my strength to rip the top of the top of the bee box, off of the hive and hit the Wendigo with an uppercut of honeybees. I got more of it in its face as the top two supers didn't separate due to being glued together with wax. The supers broke apart from the force of the strike against the Wendigo's jaw, however, and within seconds the air was just full of bees. The Wendigo let go of me and staggered back as it seemed to be trying to keep the bees out of the holes it calls eyes. With all the force it could muster, I charged at the Wendigo, hitting it near its waist and pushing it into another hive as it toppled over. With that, the air became alive with very, very pissed off bees, all of them wanting a piece of whatever had broken their hives. I was still in my suit, so they couldn't get me, but I could hear them hitting the veil with so much force that it sounded like heavy rain. As I struggled to my feet, the Wendigo continued to thrash on the ground. I have no idea if bee venom would kill it, but I had an idea that it didn't feel good at all, the way he was kicking and screaming. After all, you don't have to be allergic to die from 2,000 bee stings. Scrambling, I felt something hard under my leg. Reaching back, I grabbed my pistol off the ground and tried to get my fingers in place. The heavy gloves needed to open the bees made it nearly impossible to get my finger inside the trigger well. As I maneuvered my hands, the damn thing misfired, the recoil nearly knocking the pistol out of my hands, but I was able to adjust enough that I had a firm grip on the handle. The Wendigo was still thrashing on the ground as it tried to bury its face into the dirt, trying to keep the bees out of its skull. I aimed for the back of its head and began to place round after round into it, each of them finding its mark into the back of the bastard's head. It screamed in pain, but I'm sure it was just the heat of the bullets that made it hurt. It turned over and swung at me with its massive arms. I'm sure it was out of desperation since it didn't land a solid hit, but it hit hard enough to send me to the ground. As I got to my feet, I looked to see that my suit was torn. Though I'm not allergic to bees, the air was thick with the nasty buzzing around, as they angrily tried to get at me. The Wendigo must have been gutting through the pain of the stings as it got up and began to come at me. I tried to fire again, but the magazine ran dry. When I raised its hands as though it was ready to crush me to the ground, the Yuka-onna formed right in front of it with her arms open as though to protect me. The Wendigo didn't hesitate and tried to crush her, but when she moved in time for it to miss, she didn't see the leg shoot out like a donkey to kick her into a large oak tree. At that moment, I saw her body fall limp to the ground, and something in me snapped. Grabbing the closest thing I could, which was just a simple stick, I drove at the Wendigo and stabbed it into the neck. Without a second thought, it tossed me off like a bug on its shoulder. I landed rather hard and rolled to a stop. As I was getting to my feet, I could see the Wendigo coming to finish me off. It didn't get the chance. In a moment, the two succubi were on top of it, fully into their monster forms and tearing into it, their large claws tearing huge portions of the rotting flesh off the Wendigo as it roared and thrashed at them. My guardian was grabbed by the leg and thrown to the ground while her sister tore apart its back. The masses of congealed blood and rotten flesh began getting thrown around the trees. My guardian was hardly phased from the throw and was back up in a second. The only thing that seemed to slow them down was the bees still trying to sting everything that was still moving. Finally, they each got a hold of an arm and ripped it clean from the Wendigo's body as they braced their feet against it and pulled with all they could. It was still thrashing in pain as my guardian began to pull its head off while her sister ripped open its chest. I could hear the neck breaking as I got to my feet, but that was nothing to the sight of the large succubus ripping out its still beating heart and holding it to the sky. She then screamed out some sort of incarnation, and the heart burst into flames, and the Wendigo went limp. The girls looked and saw I was having trouble staying on my feet as I walked to them. They came to me and see if I was all right. They kept having to flinch from the stings that were still coming around. I told them to get away from the hives and the bees will just leave them alone. Pointing to the stream, I told them, I will meet you over there. Just hurry up and scrape off those stingers. As they began to leave, I added, don't pinch them, scrape. I would have to explain later, but I had more pressing concerns. Stumbling over to the Yuki-onna, the yokai that had helped me out, I found her passed out next to the tree. Due to the suit, I couldn't tell if she was cold, but I could see that she was bleeding. The hoof of the Wendigo was like a dull spear into her guts. Even though it wasn't bleeding much, it was enough to make me concerned. The back of her head was bleeding as well from the impact. Most likely, the impact against the tree had just scraped her up, but I couldn't see any broken skull. Quickly, I picked her up and rushed her down the hill to the girls as they tried to use the water to cool off the bee stings. I suddenly found myself hoping they were not allergic. When I got to them, I asked them to take the Yuki-onna into the house. They looked at me like I just asked a fish to tap dance. I told them that she had saved my life and that the Wendigo would have ended me if she hadn't helped. They looked at each other for a moment, and then they took her. Using that teleportation, they got in within a few seconds, and I could finally stop. I dropped to my knees and puked right through my veil. Not only was my adrenaline wearing off, but my suit had been torn open in several legs, the largest one on the back of me. The sensation of over 100 bee stings flooded my body, feeling like acid burning its way through my veins. Though I'm not allergic, there's only so many the human body can take. Struggling to take my suit off, my vision began to get strange. I knew what that meant. The concentration of venom had reached my brain. Thankfully, I know how to adjust my body chemistry to compensate, at least for a while. In truth, a lot of people do know how to do this, even if they don't realize it. The side effect is the massive headache you get later. But for now, I just need to stay awake. Slowly getting to my feet, I found that I didn't break any bones, but I wasn't going to be dancing anytime soon. I did find myself thanking God that I remembered to drive the ATV instead of walking. I'm not sure if I would have made it if that was the case. Leaving my equipment, I jumped on the ATV and made my best speed to the house. I took a deep breath and composed myself before I walked in the door. In the living room, there were the sisters standing over the snow woman. They had removed her kimono, and I could see the extent of her injuries. Aside from an obvious concussion, at least 2 of her ribs were broken. Putting my hand over the top, I could feel that they were cracked, but not fully splintered. Unfortunately, this was beyond my level of medical knowledge, so I called up my sister who worked in the medical field and asked her if she could come over. Even though she was busy, she made time, but it would be a while. During that hour and a half, I kept checking her vitals. Everything I picked up from all my time in the service came in handy, though I wouldn't have to worry if she would just wake up. Why? Well, while we waited, the sisters told me of how a Yuki-onna works. While moving about, they can change their form from human form to beast form to straight cold air. Normally, they hide in snowstorms because once they choose a physical form, they're subject to physical law, at least for the most part. You see, mortality is a choice for them as far as aging goes. This is why the same beautiful young woman is seen throughout the centuries. Looking at her face and body, I could see why anyone would be attracted to her. By the way, never let a succubus notice you checking out another girl. Being slapped on the shoulder of one thing, being slapped with a clawed hand is completely another one altogether. When my sister arrived, she was surprised that there was another succubus in the house, though she was a little bit more put back by the lack of clothing on either one of them. When she started checking out the snow woman, she made a remark about me having a harem, and I was quick to snap, "This ain't some anime." I got my sisters to simultaneously ask, "Anime?" I told them that I would show them later. For right now, we need to know how our new arrival is doing. As it turns out, not so bad. The ribs were cracked, but there is no internal bleeding. The bump on the head wasn't anything but a bump on the head. Aside from that, all she really needed was some time to heal, so we very carefully moved her into one of the beds of the spare room. I made sure her kimono was washed and hung up so she could put it on easily. I doubted we needed to do much more except check her from time to time. I gave that job to the two sisters. I had a mess to clean up. After putting on my spare bee suit, it was time to clean up after dancing with that monster. While trying to wrangle the bees, I found out that I had lost another entire hive, and a second one might make it if we're lucky. Thankfully, the rest were untouched. The Wendigo body had to be dragged into the fire pit so it could be burned, which I did gladly. I was beyond sore at this time. All the equipment was accounted for, cleaned, and put away, along with cleaning up the area of all the remnants of the Wendigo. I didn't know much about them at all, and I may be going beyond my requirements, but I really don't care. It was past sundown when I finally got back to the house. The sisters had made dinner for us, and we were able to talk about the day's events. As we talked, I began to try and put the pieces together, but they didn't make sense. Things like, what is a Japanese demon doing in the U.S.? Or how about why a Wendigo is now smoldering in the fire pit when it's on the wrong side of the country? These questions continued to burn in my mind as I took a shower to clean all the extra junk off my body, mostly blade stingers. When I came out into the living room, I could hear a large thump coming. I was like, now what? As it turned out, good news. As it turned out, the Yuki-onna had awoken, but she had woken with such a start that she had fallen out of bed. I kind of chuckled at this. We all went in to help her out, and I thanked her with everything I could about her help. She never did answer me in English on why she helped me out. It was strange. It's legend that they don't really help out many people. In fact, usually they hurt more than they help. But I think the fact that the two standing behind me in full demonic form made her a little nervous. I remember standing up, helping her to her feet, and then she realized she was not wearing anything. I reached over for the kimono as she covered herself, held it out for her, and put it on. I took as much care as possible, continuing to thank her, and of course my guardian thanked her as well, as she was not around, and she would have failed at her mission had the Yuki-onna not shown up. I did ask for her real name, but she was not willing to give it. I simply told her, "You have sanctuary here. You are safe here if you ever wish." She simply grinned, so I knew she understood everything I said. I walked her to the door, and as she left through the threshold, she again turned into a wisp of cold air that simply went off into the ether. I turned around, and I could see jealousy in the eyes of the two succubi that were there. Well, I looked them square in the eye and realized I only had one option. "Girls, it's getting a little too busy here. Tell you what, switch back to human form. Get your bags. We're going on vacation. We'll come back once everything's calmed down. And then maybe, just maybe, we can have a little more fun. But for right now, I just got one question. You girls ever been to a water park?"